So, a while ago now, while I was in an investigative mood, I decided to have a look at some conservative hotspots on the internet. I have long been interested in hearing the rationale of political opinions other than my own, and as you know, identifying and dispelling narratives of a false consciousness is one of the most important factors in guaranteeing craniomodernism as a successor to metamodernism. In essence, if we want to reach some kind of more just, efficient, and sustainable society, we need to be on hand to point out where thinking has been warped amongst the populace, and to know our way around the various conspiracy theories involved in this mass distraction. When I started to get involved in a comment section on the post of an ultra-conservative Wilkes Brothers funded hub known as PragerU, one woman responded to me simply by sending me a link to another YouTube video. It was an upload of a documentary by former Idaho House of Representatives member Curtis Bowers, which focused on the conspiracy theory of a cultural Marxist ploy to establish a world totalitarian government through infiltration of the Democratic Party and its associated causes. Whilst of course I was well aware of this conspiracy theory before, this document's conspiracy theory was on a different scale. I had, perhaps naively, assumed that the notion of cultural Marxism ended at the flawed, ignorant logic of dark web intellectual Jordan Peterson, who conflates Marxism and postmodernism because they both designate a difference between the interests of oppressors and the oppressed, somehow not realizing that many nationalist sentiments would also fall into this apparently conspiratorial framework. Peterson's perception of the conspiracy mostly concerns the increasingly postmodern attitudes adopted within academia, a misrepresentation of Canadian Bill C-16 as well, which sought to include trans people as a protected group in the country, and also his concern over supposed declines in free expression equal to opportunity in capitalism. Needless to say, this is definitely a part of the perceived conspiracy theory I wish to address. However, it is only a snapshot of the elaborate crackpot narrative which we must confront. With any conspiracy theory, there is a pipeline. One conspiracy always leads to a bigger and more troubling one. Cultural Marxist infiltration is fed into by relatively popular sentiments in today's society, such as notions of political correctness gone mad, or social justice warriors, or reverse racism, or any other attempts to portray changing attitudes to cultural issues as covert oligarchic ploys. But most troublingly, it is this conspiracy itself that feeds into a far more dangerous one, this idea of so-called Judeo-Bolshevism, which was the premise used by the Nazis for their policy. This extension to the theory is the incrimination of the financial system in the plot, or allegations of trying to launch some kind of great replacement or white genocide or something of the sort. And this is why perpetrators of terror attacks from Christchurch to Breivik have also cited cultural Marxism as their inspiration and justification for their acts. In essence, debunking this conspiracy is therefore of utmost importance to our own safety and that of minority groups across the world. Furthermore, the idea of evil Marxists attempting to overturn everything the populace holds dear is also a tactic used to prevent the masses from engaging with leftist ideas and societal aspirations. Hence, it serves to solidify power in the hands of the neoliberal elite of the status quo, and perhaps this explains in part why the capitalist-owned media's role in perpetuating this conspiracy is how it is. As with any false narrative, its purpose is to distract, divide, and detract from real solutions. So without further ado, let's get to challenging this conspiracy. The idea that a conspiracy theory of this sort may reference Marxist theory amongst its rationale may well seem strange at first, and don't worry, it absolutely is, but Bowers seems to use it anyway. It is in the interest of himself, or perhaps those funding him, to try and retain as many pre-existing hierarchies as he can, and as a result, any movement towards social justice or social equality must be somehow complicit or implicated in his grand conspiracy. They are, he claims, functioning as Lenin's useful idiots. In truth, this phrase has no connection to Lenin and is no longer attributed to him by anyone of any credibility. How might he tie the progressive movement to Marxism, you might wonder? Well, Bowers talks about progressives as attempting to establish a socialist society, and foolishly takes a look at historical materialism, saying, socialism is the way Marxists transition to communism. This must mean that once the communists help the progressives establish socialism, they'll step in and slap a Stalin on us. I presume. I'm obviously paraphrasing here. This is essentially the premise upon which the conspiracy theory can claim progressivism to be facilitating communist takeover, using the variety of methods that we'll address shortly. It's an allegation of cultural entryism, but it's an inaccurate one. In order to establish cranium-modernism as a cultural movement, some non-Marxist communists, such as myself, do indeed need to consider cultural entryism as a strategy. Marxists generally do not adhere to this perspective. The whole point of dialectical materialism is that there is no need for infiltration and control, that the push for communism and class consciousness is scientific and inevitable. Once ideology and false consciousness is lifted, class consciousness and class interests will supposedly be the pure motivations of the working class. Historical materialist analysis, whether or not you agree with it, is a case against the need for infiltration by Marxists, not confirmation that they have the accused conspiratorial agenda. Even Blanquism, which is a non-Marxist communist perspective from the early 19th century, does not specifically include cultural entryism in its theory, and this is a philosophy that's built upon the perceived need for infiltration. Blanquist theory talks about political infiltration, however, essentially advocating a coup or a putsch as a way of achieving socialism. It's not about conditioning the public, it's not about weakening their spirit. The idea that a procedure of covertly conditioning the public by private revolutionaries is almost unheard of in leftist circles. Things like cranium modernity and Ho Chi Minh Fort do indeed talk about this, but they are by no means covert about it. The idea that Bowers' conspiracy is written into Marxist theory itself is a lie, and it leaves him with nothing more than anecdotal evidence and an outdated conspiracy book to confirm this grand narrative is actually Marxist protocol. The idea that is briefly brought up, that these Marxian protocols have been since altered by Gramscian thought or Maoist New Democracy, are also blatant misunderstandings of their respective theories. Gramsci, who wrote extensively on ideology and cultural hegemony, took the aforementioned position of removing ideology or false consciousness from society. Mao's New Democracy, too, is described as facilitating legitimate cross-class interests against imperial and aristocratic oligarchy, as opposed to a matter of duping certain classes under the command of a higher one. To add insult to injury, the conspiracy theory seems to be confused as to the nature and definition of each of the stages of the historical materialist progression. Far from being the Stalin period, eventual communism is, as any leftist will know, a stateless, classless, moneyless society. If the Stalin period was, I guess, more correctly identified as the stage of socialism, however, then that is formed through revolution and based upon the premise that reformism would be fundamentally insufficient to bring it about. There's no incremental stage of proto-socialism within most Marxian historical materialist analyses, and as such, the idea that the strategy of infiltration by increment, as Bowers suggests, runs contrary to the very Marxist writings supposedly directing these supposed saboteurs. So to sum up this point, upon the establishment of socialism, Marxist theory dictates that the influence of the state is one gradually declining as revolutionary measures and social change is adapted. Also, just go ahead and ignore all of those misquotations of communists occasionally referenced. You can go check their validity or read them in context if you want to actually know what they actually mean. Some of the more reasoned capitalist thinkers and advocates may take the position that capitalism should be adopted due to the pragmatic justification regarding what actually may seem most efficient in the here and now being adopted to expand short-term success. This includes statements such as capitalism isn't perfect, but it's the best system we have currently, or something of the sort. While naturally this statement is in itself very arguable, it does acknowledge that there is room for critique of capitalist institutions and their role in society. You can criticize more contemporary, yet untried leftist positions for taking a risk by seeking improvements to the status quo if you so choose, but much of conservative thought does precisely the same thing, as we'll explain. And yet the conspiracy theorists of Bauer's film take a far more ludicrously imbecilic position, that is to say, one of total dogmatism. In their rhetoric, no system could ever conceivably top the apex of laissez-faire capitalism. No reform or adjustment could possibly do anything except make the current system worse. In their own words, anyone who even dares to seek improvement to the economic system, or who dares to adapt it into the 21st century, is either ignorant or evil. The objective is clear and evidently disingenuous: to attempt to portray all the issues of modern society as questions of social or cultural policy, hence cementing economic policy and the interests of those secured at the top of existing economic hierarchies, i.e. those who most likely funded the documentary. And then, despite the fierce rhetoric, Bowers and his team does a 180 turn and begins to rail against the consequences of unregulated free market capitalism. The hypocrisy and disingenuity is staggering, because the truth is, in order to be either a free market absolutist or a social conservative absolutist, your economic policy will inevitably affect your social policy, and vice versa. A complete free market elevates only what is profitable, what coerced and manufactured consumerist demand prescribes. Complete free trade means the ability of a corporation to outsource and take all its jobs to the other side of the world if that's profitable. It means no regulation to protect cultural morality, which are to be sold out for a quick buck. Putting in place what many conservatives want, such as protectionism, restrictions of free movement of labour, or protection of a religious or cultural value system, these all require regulations to what corporations can do and produce. An unlimitedly free market would leave American prosperity or Judeo-Christian values for the chop if they are not deemed as profitable as other options. An example of this is something often misattributed to cultural Marxism: pornography. Pornography is an industry that capitalizes heavily on exploitation. It is the epitome of a manufactured demand for purposes of profiteering. The ethics of pornography barely ever align with the economic leftist values of collective interest, opposition to expropriation of surplus value, i.e. not paying workers or employees enough relative to the amount they helped earn for their bosses, feminism and gender equality, ethical business practices, etc. Perceived social degeneracies, or industries which weaken the moral integrity of a group of people, are far more likely perpetuated by an unregulated free market seeking to earn profit, not existing as an easily disprovable and illogically leftist psyop. Much more potentially dangerous, however, is profiteering within more essential sectors, such as healthcare and education. Richard Sackler, for example, led Purdue Pharma to overproduce and oversell their flagship product, OxyContin, which effectively serves as medicinal heroin, being a highly dangerous opioid painkiller of a comparable strength. This was prescribed to as many people as the legal loopholes would allow, and has since led to opioid addiction skyrocketing, and opioid overdose deaths doubling per capita over the last 10 years. And once the oxycodone prescriptions expired, many patients were left addicted, having to resort to street heroin or synthetic opioids such as fentanyl as replacement, and heroin deaths have quintupled over the last 10 years per capita as a result in the US. Private ownership of healthcare means that its purpose is to make money, not to help the people. If this means resorting to opium war tactics, so be it. If it means patenting and hiding medicines from competing providers and thereby denying access of these drugs to patients, so be it. If this means short-term drugs are incentivized over preventative means or outright cures, so be it. In the USA, a country with more unregulated capitalism than most other Western nations, this is the reality. And even in my own country, the UK, We don't have this same level of crisis yet, though neoliberal politicians who serve capitalism's expansion may threaten our socialized healthcare system in the near future. There are many issues with unregulated free markets, which I've spoken about so many times that I won't go into too much more detail here. But if you are culturally conservative and wish to conserve, your enemy is not from those economically left of you, but from those economically right of you. Neoliberalism is a case in point, for it is culturally determined only by the whims of the free market. Expanding neoliberal institutions such as the EU, NAFTA, or other perceived quote-unquote globalist institutions, this is what the expanding power of the capitalist class, the big business owners, media moguls, and average people, this is what it looks like. Further deregulation, further cutbacks to social prosperity, allowing Amazon and Google to expand without limitation, mistreating the Western working class, this is what letting capitalism expand involves. At its apex, once corporate power is consolidated past a swiftly approaching tipping point, we might begin to see the rise of a much more dystopic world, one driven purely by a demand for efficiency, in which every aspect of our lives is commodified and dictated towards pure economic efficiency on the behalf of CEOs and corporate elites. Essentially, a rigid totalitarian structure of corporate fascism is gradually creeping towards reality, a form perhaps of neo-reactionary society, and the disposability of workers to automation, along with the increasing access of Amazon and Google to the Pentagon, only paves the way to this. If we do let these corporations expand to the point at which they grow to encompass the world, as neoliberal and neoconservative policies are gradually enabling, it would be a bleak future, devoid of workers' rights and regulation of the powerful. After all, capitalism has winners and losers, and if a corporation like Amazon becomes unbeatable, their power becomes virtually limitless. With all that has been done by the largest corporate leaders to get where they are already, can we really trust that they won't abuse this power to such levels again, or even respect our very humanity when they're victorious? This expansion is not just a mere adaptation of capitalism, but it's an integral part of the economic model. To gain adequate means to produce and distribute commodities, goods and services, and ultimately therefore to succeed, one must seek both consumers and investors to finance the product. These new resources increase potential profits, making shares and a part in the business more and more valuable. Stocks go up because people want to participate, because they have confidence that the business will expand further into even newer markets and gain even more profit. So we see the birth of the multinational corporation seeking its growth from overseas. We see consumer culture and commodity fetishism. Commodities are advertised and shown to be something more than what they actually are, distance from the material nature of the item in order to increase its market. Do you really believe that fur coats would be in demand if we had to kill the animal ourselves, or even engage with the reality that we value a novelty over an animal's life? What of commodities formed through exploitative labor practices? Supply creates demand, not just the other way around, as capitalists may tell you. The markets and their desires are conditioned, coaxed, and bleached squeaky clean by those who own the means of production, distribution, and exchange, giving them a whole lot of social power over our lifestyles and behaviors. If profitable, these behaviors are not necessarily in line with your own ethical or cultural vision. And if the business and those who privately control production cannot expand their market, be it a failure of the business, bad PR, a crisis disrupting how people want or need to hold on to their money, and sales then begin to decrease, it's no longer profitable for the investors and customers to remain invested in the commodity. So they pull out, making things even worse as stocks plummet. Suddenly, the business can no longer afford to hire workers, which is already a contentious topic, or make enough product, leaving us all in shortage. People hold onto their money even tighter, especially if they aren't earning as much, and the cycle gets even more disastrous. So when the markets can grow no further, we get crisis. So because capitalism is fueled by economic growth and requires economic growth, it needs this expansion to survive as a functional economic system. it may expand overseas, and it may expand in a way that runs contrary to your ethical or moral positions. Given that the conspiratorial tactics attributed to cultural Marxism is not, as we've discussed, written into Marxist theory, the only evidence linking modern cultural developments to a grand Marxist agenda is a likely fake encounter that Curtis Bauer supposedly had at a Communist Party USA meeting, and a book from 60 years ago alleging a similar agenda. This book, portraying the nature of a quote-unquote naked communist, was written by FBI agent W. Cleon Skousen and includes Ben Carson amongst its fan base. Let's take a look at its 45-step program that we communists are supposedly undertaking, shall we? The first points, far from being a communist-specific plot, seem to be basic common sense. Stop the US from nuking and slaughtering the lives of millions of people, and instead aim for gradual de-escalation and denuclearization. Seriously. If only communists actually care about peacefully solving global tensions and protecting innocent civilians, well, then the rest of the world is pretty damn depressing, even more so than we'd already assumed. Not to mention that these 3 points largely address the nuclear arms race of the Cold War. The Cold War is over. The Russians are by no means communists anymore. Putin's reactionary conservatism and Yeltsin's privatized economy should make that pretty obvious. And so, if this were indeed a mass conspiracy to get the USA to capitulate, it would appear the cultural Marxists missed their chance and no longer pose this threat. Point 9 also claims that a cultural Marxist would be aiming to prolong the legality of nuclear tests so that the Soviets can get a few more of their own in, although, again, this is long outdated. Following points discuss American trade and aid, but again in the context of the Cold War. The Soviets no longer have satellite states in Eastern Europe, so the scandalous agenda of expanding American markets into the region isn't even conceivably facilitating socialist governments anymore. Not that it was in the first place either. The type of trade and even aid provided by the USA and other global capitalist bodies like the IMF are often in the form of predatory loans, which work far more in the long-term interests of global capital than those of the indebted recipients, who, as a precondition for the loan, must undergo privatization, deregulation, and austerity measures. This precondition largely still exists, and this isn't even touching on the necessity of the capitalist markets to unlimitedly expand anyway. Then there's the implication of the UN in the supposed grand conspiracy, which covers points 7, 8, 10, and 11. Recognition that the People's Republic of China has indeed occurred, but it would be an extremely inconvenient denial of an obvious truth as to someone who holds de facto power in the region to say otherwise. Again, an aim to promote cooperation and avoid confrontation seems to be just common sense, and this goes too for appropriate recognition of the Soviet satellites in East Germany. But again, it seems they missed a chance on those ones anyway, so it's almost as if like these conspirators aren't actually that great a conspiracy. The crackpot notion, however, that the UN should be given the power to create a global totalitarian one-world Illuminati state is something else entirely. First, wouldn't even be communist by Marxist standards, nor is there any legitimate evidence to suggest the UN as an institution has this goal for any time in the foreseeable future. But opening up the Panama Canal to the international community, though, that long-awaited gesture, or given retractable authority to the World Court, which hasn't even happened on the scale that Skousen claims is coming, these must signal the first steps towards a world tyranny after all, surely. Now, aside from a relatively trivial discussion of patenting, the following points address the internal politics of the USA in more detail. The idea that communists would oppose and resist forceful dissolution of the CPUSA or the criminalization of communist advocacy, well, who'd have thunk it? Plotting to shut down the infamous McCarthyist apparatus, which is persecuting academic and popular dissents. Unfathomable. The idea that they'd try and enter into the mainstream political parties, this isn't exactly unprecedented under a two-party system where a party serves more as a platform for differing views than anything else. It's so scandalous that a communist would try and find platforms for their ideas. After all, no other political stance would do this. The same applies to entryism into the trade union movement or applying socialist reforms, in that it would be relatively logical and uncontroversial as an ambition for a political stance to take, communist or otherwise. Though given the current adoption of the neoliberal consensus, the increasing stratification in corporate power over society, and so forth aforementioned, this clearly isn't taking over the US establishment anytime soon. Oh, but Skousen also alleges us cultural Marxists to be infiltrating big business. Yeah, the banks, Wall Street, big tech, these entities are supposedly to be socialized behind the scenes to steer power towards communists and their causes. Need we say, in an age where business is less regulated to exploit and butcher the working class, the to-be Marxist revolutionaries, this one didn't happen. If only it had, perhaps you as consumers wouldn't be so mad at the status quo, because you'd reap the gains of collective good for all, and you'd pay the price of getting rid of the elitist individual profiteering of today's neoliberalism. I think that's a pretty good deal. Doing away with loyalty oaths to the Constitution, something that Skousen also accuses the commies of planning, has never happened and has never really been lobbied for. Nor would it really make anything more than an optic difference if enacted. Nor has a rebranding of the FBI occurred. Being able to reasonably seek criticism or amendment to the US Constitution, too, was encouraged by, well, the US Constitution, and I thought that seeing the flaws of any human individuals, be they founding fathers or otherwise, would be something that you conservatives would appreciate. After all, this is only trying to avoid tyranny, personality cults, deification of human beings, etc. And apparently studying non-American history and culture is bad now too. Even the histories of the 100 bajillion dead you like to go on about, we can discuss those numbers at another time. And only now do we get into the real accusations of cultural infiltration. Infiltration of the courts, education, the media, especially student news for some reason, the protest scene, and the art world. Apparently, in an attempt to subvert the strength and integrity of the nation, one cultural Marxist priority is deemed by Skousen to be making art he doesn't like or understand. Oddly specific, doesn't sound so threatening. The other more serious allegations we'll get to in a bit. But alongside the infiltration, there's also a repeated allegation of attempting to poison and weaken American cultural morality to make communist takeover more plausible. Skousen obviously could have done with a briefing on Marxist theory, which aims to forecast revolution through empowering and strengthening the masses, not weakening them. That'd be something you'd expect more from an opportunistic profiteer. We've already covered the imbecility of the notion that porn slots neatly into Marxist theory, or that some kind of agenda fitting the Marxist worldview, and the hypersexualization of culture is a similar matter, which again I have written about elsewhere, so I'm not going to go into much detail about here. Once again, nowhere in any mainstream orthodox Marxist current, as it is written that the weakening the masses would be beneficial to the communist cause, a cause deemed to be the supposedly inevitable culmination of proletarian empowerment. I must particularly object strongly on this matter to Skousen's notion that homosexuality is some kind of unnatural tool used for weakening a population. What happens in the bedroom between two consenting adults is not a political act, it's a personal one. Being gay is not substantially threatening the birth rates, for the USA maintains higher birth rates than much of Eastern Europe, where homosexuality is culturally more taboo. Homosexuality's acceptance has had seemingly little correlation to the behavior and preferences of heterosexual men and women, and there's also now evidence to show, since the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, that many homosexual people serve very competently in the US military alongside heterosexual peers. In essence, the empirical facts and data clearly show us that homosexuality is not a tool to be used to subdue the physical strength or reproductive capacity of a nation. If this were truly a goal of any cultural Marxists, it would be an illogical and uninformed technique. Unless, of course, the aim is to actually use homosexual liberation to strengthen American workers by allowing them to express themselves in the more productive and psychologically fulfilling manner that they see fit, hence aiding the Marxist cause that way, though I doubt that this was Skousen's implication. As for allowing obscenity as a means of weakening one's culture, we can do an experiment right here, right now. Fuck you, you piece of shit! Okay, I'll sit back and wait for your culture to recover from that horrific blow. There's more and more of the same. Infiltration of psychiatry and diagnosing everyone we disagree with as mentally ill until they're re-educated. I can't imagine Foucault, your postmodern punching bag, was too happy with this one. Replacement of religion to make the population more susceptible to ideas. Human rationality obviously can't be trusted, so let's just wait for God's approval before we adjust the misery of our present system instead. Destroy the family, take the kids and turn them into bootlickers. For the existing neoliberal state, obviously a successful and plausible communist tactic here. Give all former colonies independence to control their own affairs, but wait, wasn't the whole argument before that we shouldn't get caught up in international politics or support overseas? Yet, today, people still believe in God, they still have families, they still can have opinions without being diagnosed as mentally ill, and nothing empirically suggests that these are Marxist priorities of the day. The freedom of thought to question ancient documents or lifestyles, to find or lose faith in them as humans grow. Would these cultural Marxist plots even be so bad at this point? Also, just going to put it in there that the US still holds plenty of overseas territories and bases, and most certainly still intervenes in international politics. Just ask Libya, Yugoslavia, or the Middle East. So, to sum up the element to this conspiracy theory, Skousen's fantasies don't seem to logically or empirically match with the realities of a real naked communist. In order for them to be true, the conspirators would have to deviate significantly from the very theories he attempts to implicate, and as a result discredit. Not only that, but they'd also have to be of little threat, given all of the opportunities they've missed or the objectives they've abandoned unfulfilled. Aside from the glaring issues, it would seem a naked communist is just what a rational person with common sense might otherwise expect them to be. The secret, illogical, unproven conspiracies of Skousen's book aren't exactly giving any more credence to the cultural Marxist narrative than the likely fictitious allegory of Curtis Bowers. Moving on. By now you might have noticed that the narrative is already encountering various holes and inconsistencies, has seemingly no legitimate evidence pointing to its existence, and most likely is just a paracorporate attempt to capitalize upon discontent with modernity and cultural developments so as to establish controlled opposition that won't actually threaten the economic status quo. But we're only just getting to the juicy part. Coming back to Bowers' film, we are given an in-depth description of how the cultural Marxists exercise their power or indirectly control the social institutions they've supposedly been steering towards the aforementioned objectives. The film even provides us with a crude flowchart in which everything supposedly links back to Marx. Control over Hollywood, non-profits and charities, the media, the workforce, education, religion, the political system, and the Democratic Party. The issue is, many of the perceived links on the flowchart are extremely tenuous, and other items on it are woefully misrepresented. Hence, let's now explore the great web of lies, pathway by pathway from Marx to power. Let's start with the USSR route. The narrative for this pathway goes as follows. Marx inspired the USSR, a Marxist-Leninist state which went on to fund the CPUSA and use the KGB to infiltrate foreign politics. These groups would then supposedly be the ultimate puppet masters behind the Institute for Policy Studies, which is somehow behind the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the second largest caucus within the Democratic Party. Hence, the Democratic Party, and by association the Obama administration, is controlled by the USSR, and by association the ideas of Karl Marx. There are numerous glaring issues with this claim, but none more inconvenient than the fact that the documentary positing it was produced roughly 20 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Nor were the Soviet Union, who were supposedly manipulating Obama, able to re-emerge or regain any territory under his presidency. The KGB, too, are also long gone with their socialist objectives, and the idea that their influence still lingers in American politics does indeed to be a stretch at best. What's also a stretch, or is at least arguable, is the direct link drawn between Marx himself and the USSR. While I'm fully aware that the no true Scotsman fallacy is often presented as overused on this subject, this is not without reason. Marx, who painted socialist revolution as an inevitability only after having traversed the necessary stages of industrialized capitalism, actually argued against socialist revolution in Russia, seeing it as societally unready for the socialist stage of Marxism. Marx was quite specific about this too, instead focusing on the prospects for Marxian socialism in Germany, which, without the unholy alliance of fascist conservatives and social democrats during the interwar period, probably would have come to pass. Rest in peace, Rosa. This is why Leninism is specified as Leninism, as opposed to being completely interchangeable with the academic orthodox approach of Marxism, such as that of Engels' de facto successor, Karl Kautsky. Lenin essentially had to write in an exception for himself into existing Marxist theory so as to justify his own socialist state as part of a broader Marxist current. And whilst it was true, some of the deficit in the early USSR's conditions were brought closer to Marx's original preconditions through the rapid industrialization under Joseph Stalin, who called his own position Marxism-Leninism appropriately, himself an extremely controversial figure among Marxists. Stalin died in 1953, and his program was fully abandoned, with his successor Nikita Khrushchev denouncing him in 1956. For context, Skousen's book was published in 1958, and Bowers' allegation of cultural degeneration really only begins with the 50s being seen as a pinnacle of American cultural purity. Khrushchev was much less idealistic than either of his predecessors, and much less focused on the theoretical philosophies of Marx and Marxism. This is why it's largely argued among contemporary Marxists that the USSR adopted what is essentially a state capitalist program from 1956 onwards, i.e. the government operating as a big company as opposed to a cooperative, in the place of the rigidly socialist structure built by Lenin and Stalin, though then again many don't accept Stalin as a legitimate socialist either. That's cue for the Trotskyist movement. Amongst these critics were other prominent self-described socialist leaders of the time, critics of Khrushchev's, including Mao Zedong and Enver Hoxha, who saw their own respective additions to Marxist theory as in intellectual succession to Stalin's own thought. Hoxha would then do the similar thing in reaction to the reforms of Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping. Given that the era in which the KGB would have been deemed to be partaking in political infiltration was from the 1950s onwards, when the Soviet Union had been substituting Marxist theory for pragmatic politics and arguably engaging in social imperialism under Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev, the idea that the KGB would still be carrying out the definitive will of Lenin and Stalin, let alone Karl Marx, is a very brash claim. This isn't the only weak link on this alleged line between Marx and Obama, however. I will give Bowers this one. The USSR was indeed funding, supporting, and lobbying the Communist Party USA, CPUSA, until the late 1980s. It's not entirely unsurprising, and it was by no means unreciprocated, but US foreign policy during the Cold War is a subject perhaps for another day. However, it is also undeniable that the communist current in the USA was of a much different character to the Soviet movement, with notable cultural differences, despite the sense of solidarity between the two. To many, at one point in time, the party represented values of equality and social justice that were not yet as prominent amongst the mainstream parties, though membership began to fall away after dismay with the authoritarian nature of the Soviet response to the events in Hungary in 1956. It is indeed plausible that there may well have been some overlap in membership between CPUSA and the aforementioned IPS. However, to suggest that the IPS was either controlled by CPUSA or the KGB entirely is completely speculative and has only been posited by a few fringe partisan figures. It does not reflect in the IPS's actual program either, which instead of revolution and Marxist theory, focused on domestic issues at the time: civil rights, anti-interventionism, environmentalism, and human rights more generally. None of these are quite the scale of the KGB or CPUSA's goals. As a think tank, the IPS was not just using these issues as a means to covertly gain power either, as they were not a political party. Their purpose was to come up with ideas on how to solve the issues of the day, and neither orthodox Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, nor Khrushchevite revisionism was ever in their proposed plan of action. To present the organization as a whole as part of an underground Marxist insurgency, therefore, is plainly inaccurate, even if this was the ambition of a few of its individual contributors. To put this mad line of the conspiracy into further perspective, we're talking here about only one of the groups deemed to be behind the political faction, or known as the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Even Bowers and his flowchart concede that the IPS were not the only group behind the caucus's formation. Groups that, again, even Bowers won't link to the KGB or CPUSA. And in terms of objective evidence, claims that the IPS are secret puppet masters of the caucus are almost completely unfounded. The IPS, along with many other think tanks, do indeed continue to advise the caucus, but even when pressuring with other leftist groups such as Progressive Challenge, the caucus remains definitionally capitalistic in policy. Its members, including Bernie Sanders, Maxine Waters, and other familiar social democratic faces, are hardly political radicals. Its former leader, Lynn Woolsey, indicated clear support for establishment Democrat Nancy Pelosi, and the positions on economics within the caucus favor at best a Keynesian mixed economy, a far cry from the command economies of the Soviet Union or the economies that Marx would have put forward. To link this back to Marx, it was the proto-Keynesian social democratic types, such as Friedrich Ebert, who ruined Marx's dream of an early socialist revolution in Germany, rest in peace Rosa. Somehow, the idea that these milquetoast saboteurs are now the principal agents of Marxism seems a bit far-fetched, and a bit depressing for the real Marxists out there. And for what it's worth, Obama was never even a member of the caucus, who retained a leftward critique of him throughout his presidency. So yeah, no Soviet infiltration of the institution of government through that route. I think it's pretty clear to say. Our next allegation concerns a supposedly different manner in which the CPUSA is secretly behind major US institutions, in this case education and, again, the Democratic Party. This narrative, the feminist route, states that the well-known feminist icon Betty Friedan was in truth a fanatical CPUSA ideologue, and the group she founded, the National Organization for Women, has served as a CPUSA proxy to bring Marxist values and cultural upheaval into the mainstream and into the lives of American women and children. For a group of people that the Bowers-esque conservatives of the world demand other men love and be attracted to, there are an awful lot of conspiracies about women, and especially women in pursuit of their own equality. Ever since the beginning of the contemporary American feminist movement in the mid-19th century, feminism has consistently been viewed as a deliberate conspiratorial attempt to push through various political agendas: abolitionism, temperance, anarchism, Satanism, etc. Is it any surprise that it would also be implicated in the cultural Marxist ploy as well? In terms of modern American feminism, historians often gravitate towards the wave model, featuring 4 or 5 different movements based on slightly differing premises and goals, but with the general aims of securing a more just, prosperous existence for the women of the nation. Of these waves, the third and fourth tend to receive the most flack from modern conservatives. The third, which was built out of postmodern theory primarily, focused on notions of independent, diverse identities of individuals, subverting the stereotypical behavior and traits associated with femininity, and as such was seen by outlets like Prager's to be going against some kind of biological nature or copying the bad parts of masculinity. It is perhaps more likely that these surface-level half-truths are perhaps weaponized to prevent the overthrow of institutions and preconceptions which patriarchs profit from, e.g., marriage as a reason to enforce socially expected free labor, women working in cheap paid positions and subject to a hostile androcentric culture at work and on the streets, etc. This Prager narrative is quite easy to respond to, so let me address this one quickly. It discounts socialization and internalization. Under differing conditions, the world has seen many parallel female-dominant matriarchal societies, from the Mosuo to the Bribri. Scandinavia does not count as a society free of androcentric or patriarchal cultural norms. On a more contemporary level, the works of Lise Eliot and Cordelia Fine seemingly confirm the scale played by socialization in both scientific and philosophical spheres. There are also countless other experiments into socialization and gender that you can look up online as well. Our closest primate relatives, bonobos, are also matriarchal, and even though there is some hormonal provocation of certain characteristics, as well as socialized practices, gender is a relatively arbitrary category. I'm sure you know women, for example, who are more, say, aggressive and strong than men you know. Does that mean that we should reclassify their genders? And if you equate gender to sex based on chromosomes, then what about intersex people, or those with things like complete androgen insensitivity syndrome? Does it make sense to sort people into different set genders or molds of behavior based on something that only occasionally correlates to certain behaviors, and occasionally does the exact opposite, and usually depends on other contextual factors far more? To the credit of people like Prager and Peterson, however, they make the distinction that while equality of opportunity in practice should not be enforced, equality on a legal level was essentially a good thing and should not be reversed, mostly. They eagerly promote and associate with certain feminists such as Christina Hoff Sommers on the subject. To them, it's the third wave that's supposedly giving feminism a bad name, that's going too far and infringing on rights and biology and whatever it is. Bowers, however, does not have this same decency, stopping only very marginally before allowing women the vote is a communist plot to get a dumber demographic to vote them in line is crossed. Okay, he mightn't go quite that far. He might perhaps be able to concede that the first wave and the right to vote it brought was not inherently evil, but he sure as hell has it out for the second wave. This is reflected perhaps most significantly in Bowers' recruitment of Phyllis Schlafly, Friedan's arch-nemesis for his documentary, a woman who has claimed she would cancel all her political and career exploits if her husband complained that she wasn't at home enough. She claimed that there is no such thing as rape within a marriage, and was for a time a member of the John Birch Society, which are based around a conspiracy requiring its own article entirely. Prager's gang might tell you that women's gender roles are separate but equal, whereas Bowers's gang might say separate and subservient instead. Nonetheless, the attack on Friedan and the supposed root of feminism within a Marxist current is to a certain extent true. Friedan was indeed a CPUSA member in her earlier years, during the aforementioned time prior to its mass exodus. But is it really surprising? Friedan's argument was based upon equalizing opportunity for women to enter the workplace, to have careers, to gain financial and consequentially social independence from their fathers or potentially abusive husbands, and be able to choose the path that was best for them to contribute to their communities. She had realized that men and women were not monolithic categories, but individuals with unique hopes, dreams, strengths, and weaknesses, and so limiting occupation by gender roles was destructive not only for some types of women, but also for many men too. What Friedan wanted more than anything was to allow women and men a way out of misery or arbitrary limitations, to give everyone freedom to apply themselves to the projects and causes they feel they can do best at. Does this really sound so terrible? Does it really sound like an effective method of weakening national efficiency or integrity, one which a supposed cultural Marxist is supposed to utilize? And yet, according to society in Friedan's youth, these ideas were seen to be radical and revolutionary and very much out of the mainstream at the time. Hence, to express her ideas, it's no surprise that Friedan would turn herself towards a radical or revolutionary current, as the CPUSA was perceived so at the time, as a group that would even consider aspiring to something of the sort. After all, the USSR had tried to model itself as a feminist state to a large degree, and ideas of equality were essential to the communist rhetoric. By the time CPUSA had displayed its authoritarian colors, Friedan was no longer active within the organization, so the idea of her acting as a Soviet functionary, which is the claim that Bowers' graph uses to incriminate her, seems to contrast any evidence that does exist regarding her involvement with leftist politics. Not to mention that Betty was only one woman, hardly representative of the entire second-wave feminist movement. Sure, The Feminine Mystique was perhaps one of the most important books of its current, and Friedan was indeed now's most famous spokeswoman, though to suggest that she, all by herself as one individual, has been able to keep some kind of Soviet agenda on the to-do list for the organization, this would be unlikely, especially if that individual did not profess much commitment to the USSR anyway. Demonstrable evidence of the National Organization for Women's position adopting a more dogmatically liberal position than a socialist one can be seen, for instance, in their support for the Iraq War, a capitalist-driven war for the profit military-industrial complex, and the increased outreach of free markets into the Middle East, regardless of any effects upon the civilian population living there. But to put now's political standpoint aside, it may be worth mentioning what Bowers has intentionally left out, that many of its core aims weren't even achieved. The proposed Equal Rights Amendment was never enshrined into the U.S. Constitution. Racism remains alive and well in American society, and domestic violence is still an ongoing issue too. Economic justice is no longer even really being debated in American discourse, as we've already covered. If this was indeed all an elaborate and contradictory Soviet ploy, it was hardly a very successful one. Perhaps the main victory of now the National Organization for Women, beside from increasing lesbian rights, we'll get on to that in the next section, was the gain of the right of American women to abort pregnancy after the precedent of Roe versus Wade in the Supreme Court. But whatever your position on the question as to whether abortion is ethically justifiable or not, it has no consequences as to the supposed infiltration of the political system or the physical weakening of America, so to speak. As already discussed, the American birth rates are not suffering in comparison to those of its perceived adversaries. Aside from fostering an arguable turn away from quote-unquote Judeo-Christian values, we'll get to that, legalizing and normalizing abortion wouldn't really seem to be a very effective way of taking over a country in itself. Finally, before someone makes the argument that all this talk of working women and pregnancy-controlling women was all an elaborate plan to weaken the family and leave children under the thumb of the state, you'd have some unlikely allies here. Marxist feminists, even Rosa Luxemburg, rest in peace Rosa, have been writing about how capitalism is causing people to shrug off childcare, an occupation that the system deems unprofitable, for longer than you have been alive. Once again, it seems like you're blaming the wrong people on that one. Is it possible that feminism was, instead of a means of cultural and political subversion, a movement just with the pure objective of broadening horizons and opportunities for women? Occam's razor would certainly point in that direction. Okay, so next up, the gay propaganda route. Oh boy. This is another one where Bowers goes above and beyond the more mainstream Prager-types regarding reactionism levels. We've already largely covered this topic while analysing Skousen's claims earlier in this video, but Bowers takes it all one step further than that. On his chart, using vague notions of a quote-unquote radical homosexual agenda, he ties it all back, once again, to CPUSA. The response, as you can imagine, is relatively similar to what we've gone through previously, so we'll keep this one somewhat short. The link that Bowers points to between homosexuality and the CPUSA, we could think of them as the gay freedan, if you will, is a chap called Harry Hay, and if you haven't heard of him, don't worry, not many people have. He certainly didn't have anything resembling the influence or command that Friedan would have had over her movement, so even though he was a CPUSA member at the time, imaginably for similar reasons as Friedan, he too left during the 50s exodus and had been using it as a means of asserting his own struggles in a more radical environment. To say he commanded the homosexual movement would be a lie. He most certainly did not invent homosexuality, where you could argue that Friedan at least galvanized second-wave feminism, nor did he command one centralized gay rights group. In other words, to use this man as a means of showing the homosexual rights movement to be entirely a CPUSA ploy is absolutely ludicrous. Bowers shoots himself in the foot even further by attempting to bring in economist John Maynard Keynes, who happened to be bisexual and pro-gay rights for some reason, into the conspiracy as a man who supposedly brought gay propaganda into the government. Keynesian economics, for the record, is in favor of a capitalist-based mixed economy, much opposed to Marxism, so to portray him as part of the cultural Marxist web is yet again thoroughly disingenuous. Keynes didn't have much of an effect in social policy, and cannot claim credit for homosexuality's legalization, which occurred after his death. So to even mention his name seems to add to the absurdity of this subsect of the conspiracy theory. A further failure to elaborate on the difference between gay rights advocacy, something that seems relatively logical for the many homosexual people of America to support or propose, and the radical homosexual agenda infiltrating the media and Hollywood and churches and education in the Democratic Party, this wounds this allegation even further. Apparently, the only difference noted in the chart is that the radical gay propaganda was influenced by the Committees of Correspondence, a group who were forced out of the CPUSA and have minor overlap with other democratic socialist groups. But there is practically no evidence for this group causing any dynamic shift in the gay rights movement. And even if Bowers knows something, he won't even specify in anything other than vague terms on his own chart. So what? Aside from the supposed anti-Christianness of being gay in public, gay pride really doesn't do much to aid communist takeover. It's more likely that gay rights were instead part of their own independent conspiracy, a conspiracy for gay people to get rights. So you'd assume that given the rhetoric utilized by Bowers and Skousen, that this next one, the atheist route, would be the big one. This would be the link in the conspiracy between Marx and Obama, united in their shared demonic secularism, you might imagine. So what does Bowers' chart actually suggest about the supposed route? In short, it's all pretty anticlimactic. Naturally, Bowers is able to correctly identify the undisputed fact that both CPUSA members and Fabian socialists were also active campaigners and advocates for a secular society. However, in their attempt to incriminate the more prominent among the anti-Christian base, they slip up from the beginning. Roger Baldwin, despite being Bowers' preferred link between the CPUSA and the ACLU, was only one of the many comparably important ACLU founding figures and influencers, but one that actually towards the end tried to purge CPUSA members from the ACLU once CPUSA became more controversial in the late 40s. Despite even labeling Soviet CPUSA-style politics as a new slavery in 1953, it seems that this is the strongest argument that Bowers has to imply communist control of the ACLU. Meanwhile, the philosopher Dewey barely has any notable connection to the ACLU, so Fabian control of the organization also seems extremely unlikely. This is all relatively irrelevant, however, when we look at the ACLU as an organization. The allegation that they either started, controlled, or even identified with an anti-Christianity movement has no overt evidence behind it. The objective of the ACLU was to ensure that everyone received their First Amendment rights to free speech and was either made up of neither partisan liberals nor conservatives. Backing the right to gun ownership and receiving the support of the NRA, supporting staunch Republicans such as Rush Limbaugh, George Wallace, and Oliver North legally, defending neo-Nazis and the KKK but refusing to support the persecuted black communist Paul Robeson. Are you sure that these are the rabid communist anti-conservatives that you're after? The ACLU may not have been anti-Christian, but granted, many communists are indeed atheists and anti-theists, although Christian socialism, communism, especially those inspired by Eugene Debs or other figures of the American left, is perhaps more common than the anti-theist socialism in the USA. So let's address the impact of any anti-Christian movement anyhow. According to Bowers' chart, the atheist movement has aided the infiltration of communists into the institutions of, apparently nothing. That's right, even for the master conspiratoire himself, this route to power is shown to be a dead end. Christianity is alive and well in the USA. You can follow it if you believe in it perfectly easily, and its status really isn't an issue. Heck, if you're being silenced for being a Christian, the ACLU might even step in to defend you. But what of all of these decreasing moral standards we mentioned earlier, you might say? Well, as it turns out, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between levels of belief in Christ or God, or general theism, with adherence to the moral standards of way back when. You can pull the no true Scotsman if you wish, and claim that either the pro-choice or gay rights advocates cannot be true Christians, but funnily enough, there seems to be a historical precedent to the notion that the way a religion is practiced, or its preferred causes, change with time. Funnily enough, early Christianity was actually practiced in a communal proprietarian mold once upon a time. Go read Acts 2:44-45, or Acts 4:32-35, or John Chrysostom on property. So does this make any Christian capitalist no true Christian either, just because they don't follow the exact same principles or values once held at a different time in history of the religion? My point is not that you shouldn't have your own values or ethical codes. By all means, continue to develop them through your own rationale, but that social change isn't as simple as some kind of cultural Marxist infiltration destroying a belief in God. Abortion and homosexual rights, for instance, were not the products of bloodlust, a plot to weaken national integrity, or a lack of faith in a deity. There's just no substantial empirical evidence to support those narratives. Instead, these perspectives were the product of freedom of thought and expression, which saw these ideas as solutions to really existing struggles which people experienced. This doesn't mean that you have to agree that these are indeed solutions to the problems they're designed to address, and it doesn't mean you have to think these practices are worth it, but free speech and rational thinking are not only historically interwoven into Western academic and cultural traditions, but they're also a sign of intelligence and strength. If it means people reject religion or embrace certain political philosophies as their own rational conclusions, surely this is the price to pay to avoid the gullibility, irrationality, and intellectual weakness of blind faith and ignorance. Secularism isn't destroying Christianity, and it isn't weakening society to prepare for communist takeover, even if most Western communists believe a secular society to be preferable. It is in fact allowing people to look at the facts they know as precisely and accurately as they can, so as to work out the best possible solutions for their people's welfare. If you want to help reinvigorate your ideas or religious convictions you feel are dying, go out and convince people to rejoin your cause. Even Bowers concedes there is nothing stopping you from doing so. Up to this point, we have almost exclusively covered the supposed conspiratorial links between modern America and a very specific form and interpretation of Marxism, that of Soviet-style, CPUSA-directed Marxism-Leninism. Now, having covered and hopefully successfully debunked these more outlandish claims, we'll move on to the alleged links between modern American institutions and a different kind of socialism, that of the elusive Fabians. In order to dissect many of the claims made by Bowers and others more generally about Fabian socialism, it is perhaps important to first look more closely into who the Fabians actually were and what they advocate both nowadays and historically. So without further ado, the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society, firstly, was not one concrete monolithic entity. Unlike the USSR, it had and has no domineering authority figures, so Fabianism really contains a multitude of differing perspectives and opinions within its ranks. For this reason, we cannot in good faith assume the existence of one continuous Fabian agenda. Instead, we must be willing to accept that the policy proposals and political positions of the society differ as per place, time, member in question, etc. It's almost similar to the IPS in that respect. It's not a centralized entity and therefore is not monolithic. Its position is mostly as a think tank nowadays, and it has included such figures as H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, Bertrand Russell, and many others in their times. Aside from in the UK, Fabianism was influential to governments only really in Commonwealth nations, such as India, where Gandhi's prescribed intellectual and spiritual successor, Nehru, was a committed Fabian. What unites all Fabian socialists together is in the name itself. Fabian was a Roman general who was famous for avoiding attack. The Fabians do not want revolution or infiltration. The very thing that binds them together as an organization is establishment of socialism through civility, gradual reform, and amicable, fair electoralism. Some have even given up on the socialism part, but as you can imagine, even with that aside, this makes Fabianism quite controversial amongst many orthodox Marxists, who see the dialectical materialist synthesis Marx foretold his followers to be a strictly revolutionary one, with reform being impossible within an electoral system built and operated by and for the bourgeois capitalist class and their interests. Fabians are proud revisionists away from orthodox Marxism, maybe even straying to Keynesian social democracy in place of Marxism occasionally. So most definitely not the shadowy secret organization of Bowers' narrative entirely. In the UK, where the Fabian Society was founded and still commands the most influence today, Fabianists play a major role in the Labour Party. There have been many Labour governments throughout the 20th century, 3 of which were led by committed Fabians. The most radical of these, Clement Attlee, is often accredited with the founding of the modern British welfare state, including the NHS, hugely beloved in the UK even by most Conservative voters, or at least allowing the more overt socialists in his cabinet to do so, such as Nye Bevan. While strictly focusing on a social democratic Keynesian mixed economy, it is true that Attlee did engage with many traditionally left-wing issues, such as workers' rights, mild nationalisation, public housing, universal education, removing unemployment, a broad security, social security safety net, and so forth. But there was no revolution, no consolidation of irremovable power, no class conflict, no outward denigration of national culture. Attlee himself was actually a known force of patriotism during and following the war, brought Britain into NATO as a means of pressuring against pressuring against Soviet influence, and even sent troops to dispel a communist-led dock strike. Far from being the Stalin-sympathizing organization, Attlee's government is indicative of a more liberal democratic, regulated capitalist program as opposed to communist infiltration. Even despite this, Attlee was without a doubt one of the more radical Fabians. Looking to the present day, it was members of the Fabian Society who had attempted to overthrow Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the party. If Corbyn, whose yet again social democratic platform was deemed too radical and left-wing, was no ally of the Fabians, is it really that likely that the more fringe Marxist and communist movements in the UK, let alone on the other side of the Atlantic, would be? To move more specifically onto the Fabians, which Bowers deemed to be problematic, we've already touched briefly onto John Dewey. According to Bowers' web, his influence in the National Education Association is apparently responsible for pressuring the Democratic Party to destroy the American education system. However, in terms of political involvement, the NEA really haven't been as active in recent years as is suggested, urging amendment to Bush's NCLB policy, opposing discrimination against homosexuals, we've been through that enough by now, and striking on behalf of black students in the 60s for desegregation, advocating a Department of Education, stuff like this. As for the elements of Dewey's thought they promote, perhaps Dewey's strong support for strengthening critical thought and enhancing skills for informed participation in democracy are relevant. Dewey was, after all, a big fan of the US's democracy, and his ideas when visiting pre-communist China would be fully denounced by Mao Zedong upon their revolution. Disagree with Dewey all you want, but the idea that he's a steering hand of the Democratic Party towards authoritarian socialism just isn't reflected in the breadth of NEA advocacy, influence, or connections, because this would otherwise be reflected in the US education system as it currently exists, were it a successfully encroaching operation. We'll come back to the education system later, so I won't go into too much detail here, but we'll keep this all in the back of your head. The other alleged Fabian project, according to Bowers, was the student advocacy organization Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. Often associated with the New Left movement, the SDS was a grassroots organization with no central committee. As a result, it seems extremely difficult to follow the reasoning that this organization directly relates to the Fabians in any plausible manner. Students, if you haven't met any before, do generally tend to get involved with causes that they fervently believe in, so it's not entirely surprising that a movement opposing things like the Vietnam War or racial discrimination would have materialized amongst them. Is it too much to believe that this materialization may have been spontaneous as opposed to the puppet of a seemingly disconnected British political faction? And before you claim that the aforementioned tendencies for students to care about social issues were the result of indoctrination from Fabian allies, this is the 1950s and 1960s we're talking about, the time Bowers deemed the education system to be purer prior to its leftist infiltration. And it also may be worth noting that students have been a driving force of social change in the USA long before those 50s and 60s, including strongly in the 1920s and 30s, with high-profile support from figures such as W.E. Du Bois and Eleanor Roosevelt. It's pretty clear, however, why Bowers would want to tie the SDS to a gradualist socialist plot, however, because it serves as an easy means to incriminate the anti-war movement, which stands in opposition to the neocolonialism and profiteering of the military-industrial complex, which has incidentally infiltrated American social conservative movements. It serves to incriminate liberation theology, a conclusion that the Christian God probably wouldn't be a big fan of war, imperialism, and subjugation, that could never have been extracted from the Christian religion were it not for those pesky Fabians secretly controlling the churches. And furthermost, it also presents a route to link various old acquaintances of Obama into the conspiracy web, and present Obama as part of the grand Fabian plan to enact Marxism in a manner completely contrary to Marx's theory. We'll start with Reverend Jim Wallace, the less controversial of the two. A spiritual advisor to Obama, Wallace's theological perspective largely involves following Jesus' teachings about poverty and adopting a more liberal interpretation as to the teachings of the Bible. While he was indeed a figure of the pro-peace anti-war movement in his younger years, agrees with the extension of marriage to homosexual couples, and does support a Keynesian welfare state, i.e. healthcare reform, it would be surprising if he were deemed notorious enough to be included on the chart had the Obama link not be in place. Wallace has gone so far as to sympathize with the dissatisfied Christian Trumpers in 2016, due to Hillary Clinton's influence from the cultural left and what he deemed to be her overly nonchalant attitude towards abortion. But still, he's included in Bowers' cultural left conspiracy web nonetheless. I would personally strongly doubt that he would identify with any anti-theist Marxist sect, for obvious reasoning. The more controversial acquaintance of Obama, from whom Bowers seems to stem a whole bucketful of conspiratorial agendas, is the infamous radical education reform activist and Chicago socialite Bill Ayers. Ayers had been, in his youth, the founder and most notable member of Weather Underground, a very small and secretive offshoot of the SDS, responsible for the utilization of more violent tactics. A tiny but very vocal minority of the student anti-war movement in the New Left, the Weathermen indeed fashioned themselves as Marxists, or originally as Maoists more specifically, in a mold similar to the Shining Path or the Baader-Meinhof groups elsewhere in the world. Again, their position is not a position all Maoists would agree with. I mean, where's the vanguard? Let alone all communists or all members of the SDS, New Left, or anti-war movement. So to see Ayres as the puppet master behind any of these larger factions is a farcical notion. But what is even more farcical is to label Ayres the puppeteer behind the modern Democratic Party or President Barack Obama. Indeed, Obama and Ayres did know each other, as Ayres was at this point a distinguished and redeemed figure in Chicago's academic and educational reformist circles, who fraternized not only with Democrats but also conservative Republicans. Any alleged political or philosophical connection between himself and Obama is therefore not something that we can sufficiently deduce simply from their knowledge of one another or one-time cooperation. We all know Obama's defense on the subject of his relationship with Ayres, and this can easily be found on YouTube, but perhaps more blunt is Ayres' own response. I quote, "David Axelrod said we were friendly. That was true. We served on a couple of boards together. That was true. He held a fundraiser in our living room. That was true. Michelle and Bernadine were at the law firm together. That was true. Hyde Park in Chicago is a tiny neighborhood. So when he said I was a guy around the neighborhood, that was true. Today, I wish I knew him better and that he was listening to me. Obama's not a radical. I wish he were, but he's not." It was a quote from Bill Ayres in 2013. In fact, in that same year as that interview, Ayres even suggested that Obama, along with his predecessors, should be tried for war crimes regarding his authorization of drone strikes. As we shall soon go into, now having lasted through an 8-year Obama presidency, the empirical evidence would point firmly against the ideas of his politics aligning with Ayres. Most farcically of all is the premise that to this entire section of Bauer's conspiracy, the idea that Bill Ayres and his supposed influence is the result of Fabianism, the man who advocated violent revolution and accelerated class conflict, who had a program as militant and provocative as they come, being equated to those as anti-militant as Gandhi, Nehru, or the Labour Party functionaries who tried to oust their leader for being too provocatively left-wing. Pretty mad. To most of the more conspiracy theorizing sectors of the modern conservative movement, the name George Soros is probably regarded with similar venom and disdain as Antichrist. There is probably no man on the planet who is more the subject of outlandish theories about world domination. For some, his identity is a large part of why he's been chosen by conspiracy theorists to embody conspiracy. An aesthetically aged, socially liberal Jewish billionaire ticks all the boxes to be the archetypal villain for white supremacists. In fact, Soros conspiracies were only really brought into the mainstream as a cheap, vindictive political move by George Bush, but more on that later. Luckily, Bowers doesn't go too deep into anti-Semitic territory here, such as the common trope that Soros is paying Latin American immigrants to ethnically cleanse the USA, or the idea that he staged various acts of terror or racism, or that he was personally instructing the EU to sabotage Brexit. All of these random conspiracies have absolutely no basis in any material evidence and do not trace back to any reputable primary sources. This, along with the unproven allegation that he as a young boy served as a Nazi collaborator, is nothing more than a feeble attempt by neo-Nazis to feed conservatives their anti-Semitic canards through a mutually disliked figure. Don't be misled. When talking Soros, make sure to stick to the proven facts. Soros does not control the world, or every progressive initiative ever, or the world's financial institutions, but it is no secret that he is relatively progressive, culturally progressive, liberal, with a lot of money that he delegates to various causes. This is not inherently incrimination of him playing a leading role in any of these causes, with the exception of his Open Society Institute, which he is a main person within. Everything else he has simply chosen to donate to of his own volition. Funnily enough, the economic freedom to fund causes that one believes in, instead of democratically evaluating which causes to collectively support, that's something that free marketeers believe, something that the left happens to be more critical of. The real left, the economic left, do not like billionaires. They are the epitome of limitless, frivolous accumulation of power, the faces of inequality, while the people who made their money suffer, the chief perpetrators of labor expropriation. If any of these non-profits Soros donates to are indeed left-wing economically, they most certainly wouldn't be handing him the reins for a quick buck. What was Soros's even link to Bowers' leftist conspiracy anyway? Well, we've already talked about the SDS. Turns out all the master chalkboarders could draw between Soros and Marx was rooted through them. Even more laughably, the link between the SDS and Soros comes down to just one name, Arye Nair. Turns out Bowers missed a potential link. Nair was actually formerly executive director to the ACLU, if you can remember those guys, and he was in this position even at the time the ACLU decided to legally support the National Socialist Party of America in the name of free speech and expression. Nair went on to help found the Human Rights Watch and set up the ICTY after the Yugoslav wars, finally concluding with his work at Soros's Open Society Institute. In other words, he seems to have a relatively favourable reputation amongst the neoliberal international community, despite his youth with the anti-communist precursor to the SDS, the Student League for Industrial Action. Nair may have been more radical then. Now, his involvement with more mainstream organizations speaks otherwise. One could make the argument that this was all some clever infiltration, but even if that were the case, that wouldn't make Soros in on it. The only way to know for sure is to look at the Open Society Institute itself as to how much of Nair's outdated quasi-socialism would have rubbed off on his latest organization's founder, and in turn that founder's donation habits. As the name would suggest, the goals of the Institute actually refer to the open society concept of Karl Popper, aiming towards transparency, accountability, and flexibility within government. In other words, Soros's organization may be the exact opposite of how he's publicly perceived, not a shadowy infiltration and subversion, rather an attempt to bring the actions and behaviors of government, lobbyists, and people of power out into the open. So again, Soros's history defies expectations. Soros was an important financier of Polish and Hungarian dissenters, ultimately aiding in their withdrawal from Soviet-style socialism in the 1980s. His biggest concern is the government of the People's Republic of China. He supports separatist movements such as that in Kosovo and Metohija. A lot of his funding goes into what he sees as anti-corruption initiatives. Naturally, both left and right might find a bit more transparency as to what our governments are doing is preferable, but the idea that Soros is a friend of economic leftism is clearly rebuked within his economically pragmatist beliefs. Soros has, in his foreign politics, echoed the neoliberal call to bring the world under Western hegemony and enforce liberal democracy. Sounds familiar? And by opposing any sort of political or economic direction in favor of his open, pragmatic principles, we stay rooted within neoliberal society. Self-evidently, this wouldn't be an ambition or a goal of the actual left. Oh, and did we mention how Soros's fortune was built upon manipulating economic systems and effortlessly toying with capital instead of doing anything more worthwhile? Leftists don't tend to like that so much. But maybe it's not about Soros insofar as it's about what exactly he's funding. The two initiatives included on this great web that we've been referring to this whole time have been singled out specifically: Move On and Media Matters. Move On, a progressive advocacy group, is a non-profit that aims to concentrate on bringing progressives together to back candidates up and down the country who echo the progressive cause. It makes sense if someone like Soros had not taken the time to investigate all the various electoral races he would politically align with, that something like Move On would be an organization that he could trust to delegate those funds appropriately. The same goes for any other Democrat. Maybe this is how Move On has even any influence in the first place. People of similar politics coming together and to coordinate their actions is democracy in action, especially when transparently, and there's nothing subversive about democratic organizing in a self-proclaimed democracy, is there? Media Matters, on the other hand, is an odd target for any responsible citizen who favors a free and accurate press. The point of this organization is to hold mainstream media to account, or at least respond to media statements and proclamations which it disagrees with or finds non-factual. Usually this kind of process helps to brush up the reader or viewer on the accuracy and necessary context around the media they're consuming, so as to make a more informed decision after hearing both sides. This is, if anything, an initiative to strengthen American democratic participation, not subvert and destroy it. It's not like beyond Soros, it's linked to any particular radicals anyhow. In fact, it has strong links to John Podesta, of all people. Needless to say, Podesta and his Clinton-Obama buddies are not Marxists, or even in favor of Soros's open society model. As for those who wish to censor something like Media Matters, one has to wonder what truths or context they don't want revealed about their own statements and positions. Perhaps the news that the mega-capitalist, that as being essentially his occupation and income, Soros, is not a leftist after all. Okay, this next one should be a relatively short section here, because this democratic socialist route, as such, came off to me as just Bowers' attempt to highlight the position of the topical center-right political figures such as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, preemptively it would seem, within the conspiracy. It largely concerns the US's most well-known democratic socialist pressure group, the Democratic Socialists of America. Most establishment Dems don't really like the DSA that much, nor do the leftiest of the DSA folk want anything to do with the Democratic Party, so the existing overlap is comparatively minor. Grand total of 3 DSA members, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and Danny Davis, are in Congress, and in this case all 3 in the House of Representatives. The DSA do tend to endorse Democratic presidential candidates such as Bernie Sanders and perhaps too optimistically Barack Obama, though they have also contributed support to the Green Party, yay, and Socialist Party nominees from much of their membership, including even endorsing Ralph Nader in 2000. The link between the DSA and Democratic Party is therefore hardly defined, and so we shall instead be looking more at the organization regarding their supposed influence in the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We've already mentioned these guys in considering their links to the USSR, CPUSA, and Fabianism, i.e. none of much substance. First off, I'm guessing you probably flipped out at the notion of Bernie as a politician of centrist economics, but I figured it was probably worth injecting some political relativism into the equation. If the economic left is for avowed socialists, historically and internationally this has been the left's defining characteristic, and the economic right is for avowed capitalists, then Bernie Sanders is not left-wing, and most actual socialists tend to disown his place within their movement, even if they conditionally support him as a step in the right direction. A socialist believes the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be controlled publicly by workers' councils, the democratic state, or by trade unions, allowing the workers themselves to have a say on what they produce and who for, and why and what for. A capitalist, contrastingly, believes goods and services should instead be provided privately, and that production and distribution should be owned as property by a boss, employer, CEO, who dictates what their workers do and then expropriates their labor. Economically, Bernie is in favor of a mix of public and private services and industry, a social democracy. He supports a plain old European-style Keynesian mixed economy, one which aims to balance the public and private sectors. From a global perspective, his economics are therefore centrist, or perhaps even centre-right, depending on how much nationalisation he would actually have the guts to pull through. And yes, Medicare for all and the Dems' Green New Deal are about directing the private sector and are therefore not actually leftist at all, much unlike the original eco-socialist Green New Deal and socialized community-owned national health system proposed by the US Green Party. Here we have a quote here from Bernie Sanders: "I don't believe public entities should own the means of production. I do believe in private companies." And that was said by Bernie Sanders at Georgetown University in 2015. So when Bernie, AOC, any of the Nordic governments, Jeremy Corbyn, AMLO, and arguably the Venezuelan government, although to be fair to Chavez and Maduro, they were trying to change the fact that 70% of the economy was privately controlled, they were apparently too slow for the Venezuelan private sector to not catch on and collab with Obama and Bush for some mass sabotage. Anyway, when all of these call their immediate potential government socialism, we're only really talking about a form of regulated capitalism with concessions, far to the right of anything Marx would have labelled socialism. Nonetheless, Bowers links the Socialist International, a social democratic political alliance, directly to Marx, despite the so-called Socialist International, including the pre-Corbyn Labour Party in the UK, the most self-described social democratic parties around the world, and the ruling parties of many still capitalist EU nations, such as Spain and Portugal. The DSA and the UK Labour Party are indeed no longer full members, it's true, but the point is, it wasn't exactly as radical an adherence as Bowers would be suggesting. The other supposedly incriminating link of the DSA is to the CPUSA, through the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. However, the connection here is mostly just that the CCDS allows dual membership between both CPUSA and DSA, and while there are probably a few members of the CCDS who might make use of this, they probably aren't the same DSA members who are going around endorsing Democrats, let alone getting elected to Congress. Don't get me wrong, from the above paragraphs. Democratic socialism is a real, ideologically consistent political position, often interchangeable with libertarian Marxism, and there are some of these within the DSA, but the actual socialists and communists of the organization are not the people we hear about, nor the people who wield any actual authority over the names we know like AOC. For more context, the CCDS actually was originally a faction of the CPUSA that left the organization completely due to the CPUSA's dogmatic insistence on retaining Leninism in favor of more libertarian tendencies. So it isn't exactly full of closet Stalins, should that be the worry here. Similarly, the DSA's links to the Congressional Progressive Caucus and also the historical anti-war movement, i.e. the New Left, seem mostly to be interferences from overlapping membership or adherence. The DSA does often tend to endorse progressives down ballot, so there is that, but ultimately there aren't any definitive ties between the organizational entities as a whole. After all, they serve separate purposes. The DSA operates on the ground, counter-protesting white nationalism, raising awareness about the subjugation of Palestinians, women in the LGBTQ+ community, along with other marginalized groups, and pushing for reforms within capitalism. Socialism to the DSA is officially a long-term goal. They are not revolutionaries in the standard sense. Some are Marxists, some are not, and individual members have different inter-organizational links accordingly. The Congressional Progressive Caucus operates in Congress, skimps on economic reform, and sells out to Pelosi and her corporate friends. And the beauty of it all is, their size and influence adjust as people gain or lose support for them. That's a democracy. Well, not really, but almost. Anyway, it's simple. How the DSA controls both the churches and the education system, as Bowers claims, I guess we shall never know. I suppose the young DSA probably holds theory study sessions or something of the sort. Up to this point, we've already touched on orthodox Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, Fabian socialism, democratic socialism, Keynesianism, the New Left, and much more, and we'll soon add in critical theory, situationism, postmodernism, and identity politics. All of these sects are known to infamously quarrel ferociously, both with each other and amongst themselves, but nonetheless they are all unified, according to Curtis Bowers, in one major conspiracy to steer the Democratic Party into a mass Blanquist trashing of Western civilization. So why not add another sect into the mix while we're at it, eh? Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist politician and theorist, whose work is often accredited as the beginnings of neo-Marxism, if you're inclined to believe that indeed exists. We all know a bit about Gramsci's story. Upon the outbreak of World War I, the European left found that instead of this being the final straw for the working class resulting in revolution and uprising, no such revolutions occurred in the places they were supposed to happen. Especially in Italy, the response of those who had been convinced previously by Marx's historical materialist analysis of history splintered the left into many different directions. Some gave up on social change, others deserted to the newly emerging dark side. We don't talk about them. One Marxist, Amadeo Bordiga, pursued a left communist platform and sought to be even closer to orthodox Marxist dogma. His friend Antonio Gramsci took his place as the Italian Communist Party leader when the Comintern and Stalin especially started to get sick of Bordiga, although Gramsci wouldn't end up completely in line with the Soviets either. For Gramsci had his own theories as to why things hadn't continued progressing the way Marx, to Marxists, pointed history out to be. Hegemony is the word that is most commonly associated with Gramsci, and this is in turn strongly interwoven with the manufacture of ideology. The institutions of Europe at the time, he described, were essentially conditioning an ideological narrative through their imposition of influence. Therefore, the domination of the proletariat through bourgeois cultural apparatus was deemed to be creating illusions, ones that would distort the consciousness and worldview of those who would otherwise have responded in mobilization and revolution. To overcome this suppression and free the workers to react to their situation as they see fit, Gramsci wanted to lift the veil of ideology, developing counter-hegemony and resisting the unnecessary distractions, divisions, and propaganda, barring proletarian solidarity. Did this mean Gramsci opposed all the functions bourgeois institutions perform for the working class? Not necessarily. Did Gramsci hate families and want the state to take all the children? Again, no. Did Gramsci want to pollute compassionate values with satanistic sadomasochism? No. Gramsci wanted the working professionals for every institution to work out for themselves where the illusions were and aimed to reform the mechanics of these institutions into allowing more freedom for the working class from hegemonic power structures, and freedom to develop class consciousness and self-reflection as to their position and treatment by society on their own accord, the ability to organize to promote their own interests, whatever they be. Gramsci was not an American, nor placed much focus on America. Sure, critique and analysis of institutions would be undertaken by Horkheimer's tactic of critical theory, with the Frankfurt School analysis to serve as premises for improvements and reforms towards working class awareness and independence. But Gramsci never deserted the hope of eventual class consciousness, where Marcuse arguably would. I can only assume that this is why Bowers did not choose to merge the Frankfurt School and Gramscian roots of the web in his presentation, and instead chose to redirect the Gramscian influence on the conspiracy through someone else, Saul Alinsky. But the amusing part is, Saul Alinsky wasn't even that radical. He was not a Marxist, nor did he have any particular affinity with Gramsci. He opposed top-down planned economies, such as those found in socialist countries like the USSR. He opposed the New Left and the SDS, especially the Weathermen and even the Black Panthers, for being too dogmatic, violent, and Marxist-y. He opposed federal control of education in the name of individual rights. He instead admired American founding fathers such as Thomas Jefferson. If anything, Alinsky would probably have more in common with libertarian syndicalist or trade unionist movements than Marxists, as his anti-state leftism and calls for direct action perhaps bear more resemblance to Marx's rival Bakunin than Marx himself, a hugely watered-down version of Bakunin at that. Moderate enough for shameless neoliberals like Hillary Clinton to take notice of. The Gramsci-Alinsky link isn't really a philosophical one, and is only really even conceivable based on the fact that Alinsky was a community organizer. This means Alinsky would organize with disadvantaged workers, especially in inner cities, so as to collectively bargain for their human rights, a right to education, health, a job, housing, and a say in some aspects of company decisions, a role Gramsci happened to think would play a good role in questioning hegemony. Alinsky's books weren't about hegemony or ideology or Marxism or neo-Marxism, though. They were mostly only about tactics. Rules for Radicals, which was not, to clarify, dedicated to Satan. Rather, the Lucifer reference was purely a tongue-in-cheek quip relating to a previous interview on a page of quotes at the front of the publication. Rules for Radicals was a book of observations on strategy for getting their grievances addressed, and its tactics have been used by the Tea Party on the libertarian right, as well as by the intended readership of leftists. These tactics have, as a result, little to do with Gramsci's take on Marxism or revolution, and even a link to counter-hegemony is only really comparable in its continual exertion of pressure in a social debate. So when Bowers links Alinsky onto the Cloward-Piven strategy, we've already pretty much lost any Gramscian influence on this route altogether. In fact, the strategy, which essentially comprises getting everyone eligible for welfare to go claim it at the same time, consequentially overwhelming the authorities, inciting racial and class tension to force politicians towards a more pro-worker agenda, it's not Gramscian at all. It bears arguably a small resemblance to Alinsky's strategies of pushing a systemic flaw to its limit and polarizing the question, but it's not about counter-hegemony and even relies on dividing workers, the opposite of what Gramsci was after. The strategy has not been implemented and relies on the insatisfactory nature of the welfare system. So for all the rightists out there, if there were no welfare, the effects would create that tension for proponents of the strategy anyhow. So this is not an acceptable argument to get rid of welfare. But the strategy has not been implemented and relies on the insatisfactory nature of the welfare system to serve as a force of accelerationism, i.e., the more the flaws of capitalism are oppressed, are made evident, the greater likelihood of worker response. And then we move to Acorn, a non-profit founded by former SDS member Wade Rafke, who Barack Obama once served as a temporary attorney to in his younger days. It is worth noting that Acorn have disbanded in the US after a couple of conservatives manipulated evidence to infer that a few low-ranking Acorn activists were instructing people on how to break the law in their campaign to get more poor and African-American people voting in 2008, but Acorn were naturally exonerated by the judicial system. The organization in practice, far from a criminal base, was somewhat of a community organizing platform, and it campaigned on issues such as combating gentrification, ensuring adequate provisions of the welfare state, or what exists of it in the USA, and letting the poor prosper too. Shared prosperity isn't a wacky Marxist thing, by the way. The World Bank promotes it, and we all know the World Bank IMF role in forcing countries into neoliberal reforms to escape US exacerbated economic hardship in leftist countries. Bowers appears to be challenging, he appears to be alleging the conspiracy or the conspiracy theory that Acorn used a Cloward-Piven strategy to cause the crash of 2008 as a means of linking them, though there is no evidence for the allegation, and plenty of more convincing, factually based theories on the crash's causes. So where is Gramsci hiding out in Acorn? We may never know, but the closest we can find is probably in Acorn's defense of the human rights of illegal immigrants, because, they're humans too, and the US can probably afford to be a bit more charitable to them when their own neo-colonial economic hegemony most likely had a role in causing the economic strife in their countries of origin. If this really is the only way that the group Bowers proclaims to be Gramsci's direct descendants are resisting hegemony, then methinks Gramsci would be a little bit underwhelmed. Alright, final route. When people mention the words cultural Marxism, this route, the Frankfurt School, is usually what they're talking about. Don't worry, we're going to talk more about the disciplines of sociology and general critical theory later on in this article, but I'd like to take this section to address Curtis Bowers' implications about the route through which the Frankfurt School supposedly are steering US institutions towards Marxism specifically. This means we're mostly going to be talking about the implications of political correctness here, however out of place it may seem to those who actually understand the relevant subject matter. You may have been told that the Frankfurt School were the guys who initiated swapping in the class struggle for identity politics, and this would be a gross mischaracterization, so just to unlearn all of the quips you may have heard from Ben Shapiro on the subject, if you can, just hear me out. The story of the Frankfurt School starts properly in the 1930s, in which the involved intellectuals fled Nazi persecution and relocated to the USA, Columbia University. Their specialty was critical theory, a form of analysis, and members such as Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and Fromm aimed to investigate how capitalism and its relevant structures change social behavior and social organization. In other words, they weren't writing manifestos as to how to enact any Marxist revolution in their academic work at all. None of them, not Marcuse or Adorno, or anyone else ever wrote anything about infiltrating, subverting, or weakening society through control of culture and propaganda. Go read, you won't find anything. Yes, they built upon a Marxist analysis of capitalism, and yes, they weren't big fans of capitalism generally, but in fact, many Marxists actually dislike Marcuse and his friends for not being revolutionary or Marxist enough. You see, Marcuse actually wrote about how the existing capitalist state, tyrannically perhaps, weaponized mass culture to appropriate symbols of dissent or rebellion towards their own agendas, hence repressing the public from revolution. It was, to many, quite nihilistic and was definitely an orthodox and controversial shade of Marxism, one that did not attach itself to a political solution, and, in fact, perhaps the reverse. You can agree or disagree with Marcuse, it's up to you, but he wasn't calling for a mass infiltration and subversion of culture. It seems a little odd to suggest that he's some kind of founding father to an underground academic insurgency. Academics can and do reference Marcuse's work in their own analytical conclusions, with some agreeing and others not, as this is the way any academic debate, any academic subject progresses. Supporting or opposing that work is not a question of ideals, but a question as to whether or not one finds gaps or assurance in his logic. So, hey, if Marcuse did, in the end, write the textbook for a radical agenda, now supposedly accepted by the intellectuals of today, how can we really claim he transmitted a uniform agenda, one which he never publicly released to contemporary sociologists? Was it telepathy? To be fair to the conspiracy people, Marcuse did believe that there was still some hope of system change from those that the system was not able to engulf due to their own existential quarrels with the present order. In other words, disadvantaged or marginalized identities could be a last hope for radical intellectuals to gain support. But this is just analysis. It doesn't say anything about manufacturing false oppression, which is attributed to him, nor the concept that social decay as such as any sort of goal or method, or that political correctness should obscure or mislead people into causing revolutions. Overcoming the cultural industry is not a destruction of tradition, but rather a revitalization of tradition. It's reattaching the meaning and purpose to the art forms and culture that was appropriated, and its liberation from a prevailing ideology of false consciousness. People often point to political correctness and cancel culture as aspects of control, coercion, and delusion, whereas the broader question of ideology is completely ignored. The bourgeois narrative designed to reinforce oppressive hierarchies, according to Marcuse, is conditioned through the appropriations of the culture industry, and this is why he gave up on class consciousness being able to arise. According to Guy Debord, a French writer on ideology, it's the spectacle that has consumed humanity. We're all driven by the notion that products and positions will fill the holes left by alienation, as opposed to actually filling those holes with the meaning and purpose of genuine situations. We'll come back to mass commodification and co-option of social justice by profiteers shortly, but this is all part of the same concept. The analytic, intellectual, often leftist response to issues one faces in their life has been strategically diverted and misdirected towards false consciousness and appeasing false narratives. So, reducing questions of human nature, for instance, to historically disprovable oversimplifications, or the myth that we have equal opportunity now, despite what complex social analysis shows, and so forth. The idea that the principal victims of PC cancel culture, therefore, are edgy right-wing comedians who tell a joke people find offensive, or disingenuously reductive race scientists, is hugely problematic. Oftentimes, their fall from grace is not censorship, but simply a reflection of dipping public favour. Democracy, whoa. And you can still find their perspectives. Their narratives have not been completely misappropriated or blotched out, though in the way that victims of ideology have been. Hence, the economic left in the West barely has a political platform, and silly conspiracies, or conspiracy theories like cultural Marxism, are contrived so as to steer people away from the big bad Marx guy. And when people make a big deal out of PC or cancel culture rhetoric, they instead frame progressives and vulnerable communities as oppressive or controlling forces, obscuring the left even further, when obviously we know it's the other way around. Political correctness, in fact, was originally a term of satire used by the left to mock those who stuck too rigidly to their party line. In this day and age, if we were to use the term political correctness in the same manner, it would be referring to the staunch neoliberals and market fundamentalists, not to mention the concept of patriotic correctness, which also exists within certain sectors of Western society. This is not to say that certain elements of social justice, as well as some elements of arbitrary national pride, are not manufactured into a political correctness of any kind, but is for profiteering purposes, not for revolutionary purposes. Don't believe me? Look around and see who its enforcers are. Corporations, Hollywood, rich elites. Look at all the revolutions they're instigating. So yes, maybe the Democratic Party and some of the main institutions of the neoliberal order do try to appear socially just, diverse and multicultural sometimes. Efforts towards social justice are usually the result of sociological consensus on ways to create equality of opportunity for those of all identity groups with societal implications. And so it naturally is considered compassionate to care about social justice issues by many people amongst the public. Hence, it is profitable. Efforts towards multiculturalism, diversity, and tolerance again rightly look compassionate because they allow understanding and coexistence, even enrichment of all differing ways of life. So they're profitable too. Cultural division and separation, after all, prevents both the expansion of markets too, even if it does divide working and oppressed people quite conveniently. In essence, the point is that in an academic context, one must display enough accuracy and comprehensiveness in their theses. Again, more on this later. In a cultural context, norms and their application are wielded by those in control of the culture industry for their own agenda. And if Marcuse is correct, this is something the left will not gain control of. As a result, the left must look to those who are outside of mass culture's reach. Many economic Marxists, and these did exist at the time and in the present day, albeit somewhat quietly, disavow the Frankfurt School's conclusions, but never mind all that. Postmodernism, with its attached principles of moral and cultural relativism, is a cultural movement from the latter half of the 20th century. It was not practiced by the Frankfurt School, would have been hated by Marx, whose universal truth would have been completely unaccepted by postmodernists, and isn't really anything to do with identity politics that much either. Its intention is to place all truth and structure in question academically, to increase comprehensiveness in answers to various social questions to the maximum extent possible. It does tie into the multicultural scene, often for this reasoning, but aside from that, it is relatively lazy to be thrown into the grand conspiracy. I'd recommend reading some postmodern theory to judge it independently of any non-existent conspiracy theory, or non-existent conspiracy rather, as it is often a separate political spectrum to any left-right continuum and can be both embraced and reviled within leftism. This section may have seemed to have glossed over some of the more specific commentary on social justice or cultural progression, but these will be addressed in the final sections of this video. Oh, and before we continue, let's move past Curtis Bowers on a quick note. Since his documentary came out in 2010, there has been plenty more to add to his conspiratorial flowchart, and luckily we thought we'd do him a favour and fill it in for him. But I think perhaps the best place to start is a little quote you may be surprised to read. It's a quote by Marx and Engels in their address of the Central Committee to the Communist League in 1850. Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary. So, Well, yeah. I mean, if the cultural Marxist conspiracy is coming to take away your guns, then Marx and Engels are standing with you on that one. To the pseudoscientific claims like mask wearing or vaccines being tools of sedition, look for up-to-date peer-reviewed scientific journal entries. These topics are not questions of opinion, they are based upon observable fact, and scientists have done much more in-depth research than you have. Obviously, I'm not your government, I can't force you to do anything, but I do think that it makes sense that avoiding breathing potential coronavirus into people's faces, or avoiding risking your child's life to a disease that could have been prevented when the vaccine amounts have indeed been determined as a result of scientific study. It's just common courtesy, really. There are plenty of better ways. An all-powerful conspiracy could sedate you anyhow. To the worries about Black Lives Matter and Antifa, these aren't monolithic organizations. In fact, they're very decentralized, both of them, i.e. there are no leaders, there are no central committees. Each local chapter kind of just does things how they see fit at each moment. They may look a bit scary on Fox, but the groups are only expressing their right to protest on issues they care about, be it in reaction to acts of racism or acts of fascism, exercising their right as free citizens to protest. After all, Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, and Tucker Carlson are all alive and well, and all retain their platforms, even if there were, at points, if they were focus of protest. On the other side, 115 terrorist attacks have been carried out in the US by rightist extremists, which is almost double the attacks of Islamists and over 6 times that of leftist attacks, with the right extremists killing 79 people, leftists only killing 7. Personally, I'd be quite glad if my own free speech helped to intimidate a fascist from carrying out an attack like that, or some kind of putsch of the government. To the worries about large-scale police or justice reform, decentralization of these services does not mean lawlessness. It's a question of ownership and control. The policing being organized by the community holistically, subject to community personalization, this approach would replace the current hegemonic suppression of would-be prospering communities by current institutions. Community policing, the alternative to the current police structure, is essentially a question of democratization, so whether or not you find merit in it, it is unlikely to be part of a scheme to assert total control over the country for shadowy organizations. To the worries about Me Too being a way to make us all subservient to women, if it makes people afraid to touch people, like men, women, or children who don't want to be touched, well, good. I mean, due process does still exist to root out the false claims, but those false claims are extremely rare and would have to be the product of a hugely vindictive individual to keep a case of that sort going on for so long. Though with the amount of rapists and molesters who prowl the streets, having never been caught or even accused, the rare false allegations of meticulous psychopaths probably should be a secondary concern. And please don't blame the victim. No one should be non-consensually touching others inappropriately to start off with. This should be pretty clear. To the claims of destroyed masculinity, go live a life that's best suited to you. I mean, that's what the left wants to enable for you, at least. And if that includes elements of traditionally masculine behavior, so be it, as long as it's not hurting others. The left and economic leftism will help you in this. It's the neoliberal territorialization to the market that may threaten your freedom to live life how you best see fit. To the worries about the implications of trans people in sport or in bathrooms or society in general, I'd urge you to look into the science. I'd recommend keeping up to date with relevant studies and their methodologies, as well as knowing statistics on the extremely low detransition rate, the suicide and murder rates plaguing the trans community, and some general experiences of discrimination that their members face, in case someone tries to make an argument that deciding to transition is about seeking some kind of more privileged position in society or simply done on a whim. We won't go too much into science here, but the essentials to look into would be the intersex community, the development of sex characteristics of both types within either sets of chromosomes, the the frontal lobe of the brain, the SDNPOA, brain volume and so forth of trans people often being closer to the average for their gender identity than for that of their assigned sex. The truth about dimorphism in hormone levels and their actual effect on athletic performance, etc. Simone D. Sun wrote a great piece on some of these things in Scientific American, and there's plenty more, even in the mainstream, from accessible media sources that explores the other nuances to the issue. But don't worry about your child in a bathroom of a trans person. The real predators to worry about never have had to transition, both in past and present, to do unspeakable harm. And focusing on trans people who live strictly by their gender identity is distracting from stopping real issues. To the claims of historical erasure, it can be difficult to divorce a person's philanthropy from how they receive said money or glory in the first place. So perhaps your statues might be better in a museum, where the context is fully explorable, and that's all that we're suggesting on the left. Whitewashing the evils of past historical figures is far more historically revisionist than that. So if history is truly your concern, maybe consider the museum idea instead of glorifying monsters from the past uncritically. To the worries about the Chinese, North Korean, or Iranian government, these nations are historically and politically non-interventionist, at least outside of their immediate vicinity. If they invaded the US, they'd lose, and if they start infringing on your country's sovereignty, they'd lose. Most people on the left have complicated and varied thoughts about this trio anyhow. To the worries about the Nation of Islam or Islamic fundamentalism or any religious fanaticism, we dislike it just as much as you do, so long as we focus on the extremist sects themselves instead of scapegoating an entire varied group of people. Also, feel free to celebrate any religious festival you want. Yes, including Christmas. There is no war on Christmas, I promise. To the worries of people of immigrant or non-white backgrounds having some kind of innate proclivities towards certain political positions, intelligence quotients, criminality, or whatever else, just no. Refuting the main conspiracy theorist on this matter, who's Charles Murray, that deserves its own video, although do look into the relationship of these trends to class or socioeconomic background. I think you'd find it's much less about race or biology than other factors. Also, there are US-style conservative or liberal democratic governments all across the world. Go look. It's obviously not a racial proclivity thing. I mean, one of the good examples of this is in relation to the IQ and race question is to look at Ireland. When Ireland was in a much more deprived state, its average IQ was decisively lower than the rest of Europe. Having caught up in human development, in quality of life and so forth, that has largely equaled itself out. So again, to portray these things as biologically deterministic is not empirically supported whatsoever. To the worries of civil service bureaucrats serving as part of a deep state to subvert the instructions of their bosses, think of it this way. To be a civil servant, your job is to enact your instructions. It's not to write laws and legislation itself, and therefore if you fail in your job or warp it towards your own purposes, any competent boss would fire you. If the instructions of the president are not being fulfilled, well, then that'd be pretty visible, and anyone who let such happen would be placed in the firing line. In the case of the civil service, subverting bosses is even illegal. The idea that a subversive deep state is trying to serve its own need for importance and is willing to act undemocratically is fixable for competent presidents to arrange. When this excuse is used, a more likely reasoning would be that it's just that, an excuse for one's own failings and errors. To the claim that Marxists and Marxist theorists don't actually believe in what they preach and are actually all secretly a front for a never-ending hierarchy, including every single figure we've talked about, this begs another question. If not a shared, genuine belief in a socio-political analysis, how else would these people be coordinated together? There would have to be some sort of greater conspiracy behind Marxism for which the ideals would just be a front. And needless to say, there's no proof for any Illuminati-type organization, nor any ethnic hive mind as proposed by more dangerous reactionaries. It is infinitely more likely that Marxists actually follow Marxism because they are legitimately convinced of the theory behind it, and they believe that it forecasts a better world ahead. Hopefully this clears up, to a large extent, any supposed incrimination of the economic left in any plot to subvert, infiltrate, or destroy society as a whole. Anyway, moving on. Democratic Party liberals will often, when confronted with claims such as those that we have dissected here, often try to make the case as to why not to blame Obama for the failings of communism. We're going to be doing the opposite, the absolute reverse of that. So, without further ado, here's why not to blame communism for the neoliberal hellscape of the Obama administration. Here's where we explain how we know Bill Ayers was not a secret puppet master of the president, and that the left does not in any way support the status quo, and that we probably have some ideas that could probably help suit your anti-establishment woes a lot more than giving rich people more money will. Oh, and side note, if you don't like left-wing non-profits or churches, you don't have to engage with them. To see either as part of the establishment or evidence that a conspiracy is working is by no means guaranteed in accuracy. These organizations are no more influential than those who contribute to their causes promote them to be. It's called freedom of expression, and if you want, you can go found your own church or non-profit for your own views. It's a lot more easy than you'd think. Anyway, in case you missed the point earlier in the video, Marxists and the left don't like the unregulated expansion of capitalism. Capitalism is a system under which collective good is sidelined for the individual profits of a tiny elite, exacerbating inequality as the rich earn faster than the poor. It is worth remembering that money is an exemplification, with capitalist hierarchy, of power, and power is relative. If a crisis hits or supplies dry out, it doesn't matter how much money you have, rather how much you have in comparison to those who also want their needs accounted for, how much you can outbid them. If crisis does not hit, no matter. The gap or stratification between you and them becomes harder for them to overcome, and they may be confined to their role as workers for the rest of their office or factory-oriented lives, due to the lack of freedom to take economic risk. Talent is squandered, power is consolidated, and weaponized for the profit of elites, utilized to suppress us in their dream of ruthless efficiency towards more and more accumulated profit. It's no surprise that labor unions, democratic, often decentralized groups oriented towards standing up for the rights and conditions of workers' employment, would oppose and bargain against the status quo, against unlimited exploitation. To demonstrate exploitation more concretely, imagine you have been hired by your friend to make an ice sculpture. Your friend gives you a $50 block of ice, and you sell the sculpture, once complete, for $250. How much should you and your friend earn? Well, perhaps the friend only gets $50 back and that he lost and cannot use later. Perhaps, seeing as they contributed 1/5 of the price, I don't know, you could maybe make the argument that they get an additional 1/5 of the extra $200 on top. So they get $90 total, whatever. But no, he takes the earnings and instead pays you the wage he determines, and it's not $250, it's not $200, it's not $160. And remember, it's all well and good talking about ice sculptures, but when we talk careers, you need to work in a competitive field, and you don't often have the luxury to go and find a better deal because your son might be hungry. Expropriation of labor, which is when your bosses take your work's profits and pay you wages instead, is the common labor practice of capitalism, neoliberalism, and the status quo. Opposition to it, however, is the central component to Marxism. If Obama were a Marxist, surely he'd stop this system expanding as soon as he could, and surely he'd take a stand against current economic and labor protocol. Yet the Obama of reality did the exact opposite. Arguably, Obama helped private capital expand more than any of his predecessors, and nowhere is this more explicit than in Obama's foreign policy. US and NATO-driven regime change operations increased as US interventionism increased from 4 countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria, to 7 over the course of the Obama administration. The wars that were started by Bush didn't cease either. Obama ordered more recorded drone strikes in his first year than Bush had ordered throughout his entire 8-year administration, 52 to 48, even if troops were coming home. The interventions that were waged, not by Bush but only by Obama, included Libya, a country whose leader, Muammar al-Gaddafi, had an anti-capitalist, quasi-leftist and arguably conservative political position. Say what you will about Gaddafi's authoritarianism, but the quality of life in the Libyan Jamahiriya for the average worker was far better than in today's Libya, the civil war engulfed failed state, where of evils such as religious extremism, widespread impoverishment, and even slavery have re-emerged after the removal of the man who kept these at bay. Almost all Marxists heavily denounced the NATO invasion of Libya, predicting this outcome at the time back in 2011. Somalia, another one of Obama's targets, may often have been likened to a closest real-world example of anarcho-capitalism, but was a failed state undergoing famine at the time of Obama's drone action, and its population was already struggling. So again, any Marxist would find intervention here disgracefully depraved. Little could be more shocking, one might imagine, until we consider that the third new target country was Yemen. Yemen, where the USA supplied a Saudi Arabian-led bombing campaign with weaponry, refuels and military intelligence to massacre innocent civilians in what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Deliberate blockade, destruction of infrastructure, and civilian bombing has led to a cholera outbreak and the worst hunger rate in the world. Whilst the bombing alone has killed thousands of civilians alone by the end of Obama's presidency, it was speculated by the UN that 13 million face starvation, and in 2018, Save the Children reported 85,000 under-5s to have starved to death up to that point. This intervention is sickening to any post-colonial anti-imperialist movement and has obliterated Yemeni proletariat. Not at all an intervention that any Marxist or any rational human being should support. In no way are these interventions that originate with Obama to the benefit of the workers, their Marxist spokespeople, or any domestic destabilization conspiracy, but they are profitable to the military-industrial complex. Military hardware corporations, who many in the US government rely on to provide jobs to their constituents, make billions of dollars from arms exports to conflict zones, and these arms exports increased by almost 25% under Obama, the biggest client being the reactionary totalitarian Saudi monarchy, who are currently committing war crimes in Yemen. Regime change also paves the way for multinational corporations to expand into markets with previously hostile or regulatory economic policies towards them, such as intended with Libya, earning money by rebuilding the country, by gaining easier access to new customers and resources, by reporting about conflicts in the media. It is financially profitable for corporations, their lobbyists, and consequentially neoliberal governments to go to war, especially against those who reject neoliberalism in favor of a more left-wing economic model. Any national leftist opposition to the status quo is crushed, and this isn't even mentioning the economic sanctions used to cripple and bring Venezuela to heel, or the support for the coup in Ukraine, or numerous other foreign policy mess-ups from the perspective of Marxists or rational people. At home, Obama's economic policy, too, also echoed the will of expanding capital, notably regarding privatization. As corporations push to expand, neoliberal politicians such as Obama sell off government services and responsibilities to private companies, perhaps to redirect the budget towards other things, such as war, or tax cuts for rich people, and so on. Whilst this is true, some of Obama's budget was indeed put towards some conciliatory measures and protections for working people, such as what he attempted to do with Obamacare or adjustments to labor laws and the minimum wage. Perhaps this served more to quieten the masses after the economic crash of 2008 than out of genuine concern. Employing a certain temporary Keynesianism, Obama increased taxes and helped big business get flowing again, essentially bailing out the big banks on Wall Street, supporting and adjusting the actions of his predecessor Bush. And for all the small benefits that workers may have received, healthcare remained under private ownership. The privatization of prisons and the justice system was even sustained throughout a large portion of the Obama era until it was deemed detrimental to the anti-racist image that the administration aimed to project. Education was passed further into private hands, with privately operated charter schools increasing and gaining massive grants. He encouraged the privatization of new transit, water, and waste infrastructure when it came to investment. Private prisons continued, and the population of private detention centers for illegal immigrants increased. Funnily enough, the top 1% of the American public gained an extra 6% of America's wealth throughout the Obama era, at a quicker rate than under his recent predecessors. But surely that is, just coincidental. Perhaps Obama may have tried to appear to befriend the interests of the masses, but in truth he was continuously and reliably handing power back to private corporations and the elites at their head for their own expansion and their own accumulation of personal profit at the expense of what might be best for America collectively and its people. The private sector and profiteering interest were given free routes deeper into the heart of the American economy, and from there on, they received relatively stable economic growth throughout the majority of his presidency. Capitalism under Obama, the economy in the hands of private corporations and their shady CEOs, was not threatened, but strengthened and allowed to expand however much it needed. Needless to say, not great for the Marxists trying to overthrow private control of the economy. A lot of people perhaps believed, following Obama's speech on his experiences with Cuba, again attempts on behalf of private capital to persuade the Cuban government to be a little less hostile to the American corporations looking for new markets, that he had outed himself as an anti-capitalist, claiming that instead of choosing dogmatic philosophies of capitalism or communism, he said to choose what works. And this statement, far from showing his underlying Marxist sympathies, is actually devastating for Marxists. Refusing to transform a society or press on coherently towards an ideal limits one's capacity to change the existing system. This kind of third-way radical centrist pragmatism only reaffirms the existence of the major structure, committing itself to minor tweaks upon topical concerns, as opposed to systemic changes. What this means, in turn, is that neoliberalism continues along its destructive path, and potential for change is instead consumed by indirection. Two parties run the USA, the neoliberal one and the neoconservative one. In the sense of economics, the two aren't that different. They both aid the expansion of capitalism, are willing to go to war for it, and generally stick to a generally flawed and reductive consensus that this is the end of history and society can't get any better than this. The debate, now that economics is no longer contested to the same degree, is instead shifted to social issues, debates of ethics and morality, and it's amplified to the maximum. We're left with a polarizing, overhyped, and not really existent culture war. And this, my friends, is all a part of the big distraction. This is neoliberalism. Obama and the modern Democratic Party are indeed prepared, perhaps, to make a few concessions on social issues, knowing it will fuel the debate. It is to any leftist so clearly disingenuous, though. If they really cared about equalizing systemic disadvantages or advantages for different identity groups, or creating real equality of opportunity, this, by the way, is what social justice means, why don't they address its largest and most currently troubling obstacle, economic injustice? Accumulation of hereditary wealth and property empires through the arbitrary, effortless means of capital, this is central to the notion of social injustice, and the creation of class systems within rich and poor are treated, judged, and governed differently. But it's the performative, tokenistic change that is often emphasized by many in the Democratic Party. There's no addressing of the big picture as to what is creating that social injustice. There's a reason a term such as virtue signaling has come into use, because it's all about personal individual virtue and shaming, and not really about combating those at the top of present-day hierarchies as they really exist, those who profit most from them, and the hegemons who help to most effectively perpetuate them. In the words of Noam Chomsky, you find the business sector reasonably willing to support efforts to overcome racism, and sexism. It doesn't matter that much for them. You use a little white male privilege in the executive suite, but the basic institutions of power and domination survive intact that way. Then, when someone like Obama finally does make a concession to the struggles of some particular identity, it is viewed as preferentialism against other economically disadvantaged groups. The pragmatic, overly specific nature of the changes that are brought about alienate many of the other victims of current systems, hence the oppressed are divided and conquered. But at the core, the two divided narratives, the two divided US political parties, they both serve the corporate lobbyists and the expansion of capital and actively suppress both class consciousness or any attempt to intersect the struggles of all working people in one attack on the system. When Edward Snowden leaked details of the ever-expanding extent of the NSA and its online surveillance, it was Obama that he was running from. The NSA, which serves as almost a panopticon from the Bentham thought experiment and elaborated on by Foucault, it is many ways nowadays the epitome of control, because while we do not know if we are being watched, we know there's that plausibility, and we're coerced into falling in line as a result. Along with the notoriously anti-revolutionary FBI and CIA, along with the random abductions of ICE against immigrants, yes, Obama expanded ICE and even oversaw the construction of many of the most controversial border facilities, or various police departments against protesters, not Obama specifically, but more his intellectual successors Cuomo and Biden regarding the NYPD, for instance. Obama extended Bush's USA Patriot Act. That's another thing, expanding the capacity and legality of U.S. governmental authorities to surveil, wiretap, and investigate what they deem to be terroristic. In other words, actually trying to seek an institutional response to systemic injustice was made much more difficult by Obama as opposed to vice versa, because of all of these things we've just mentioned. The political solution doesn't work because of the alignment of the two parties. Revolt doesn't work because of state capitalist power. This Obama guy and the state of the establishment today, they totally seem to be helping Marxist revolutions happen. Am I right? That's ludicrous. Nor did Obama attempt to sow the seeds for a generation of revolutionaries. As privately discussed, private ownership and control of education was allowed to continue in prosperity under his administration. Partially because of this, and also for political pragmatism, almost every school or college subject has been injected with questions of economics and profitability, far more so, at least, than the accused injection of sociology or critical theory into said subjects. The commodification of education, treating perhaps one of the most vital services humans will ever provide as a quantifiable tool for maximizing profit, is deeply troubling and upsetting to Marxists and to everyone else. Culture, perhaps one of the most important aspects of human expression, is not immediately monetarily profitable, and so arts and humanities fall in popularity against a looming methodical adaptation of the more easily quantifiable and profitable STEM subjects. The emphasis in education as a general trend is again towards short-term monetary profit, and this is deeply troubling. If we cannot take culture by the horns and respond to it, we do not practice analyzation or evaluation, skills that are undoubtedly necessary for informed democratic contribution, analysis and evaluation. If we cannot continue letting culture flourish and progress, and human society with it, building upon our admirations and grievances about the past, what is even the point of Marxist critical theory, and how can we expect to advance past the most troubling lingering phenomena? A Marxist would spend as much time and money as possible to develop a comprehensive reason consciousness, a capacity for historical and social analysis, and a culturally flourishing youth through a robust not-for-profit education system. Obama's continuation of the ongoing quantification and commodification of education and the underlying undervaluing the undervaluing aspects to education and even teaching positions as unprofitable was, again, very much not in line with what you would expect a Marxist ploy to be. But there are other establishment forces, you may say. The media, Hollywood, surely these might still press on along the Marxist agenda. Well, the media, too, is also a commodity under neoliberalism, just like anything else. Media corporations from CNN to the Washington Post are owned privately by billionaires and oligarchs because they make a personal profit. They are businesses, they are investments, they are there to make headlines. They need a narrative that appeals to their private oligarch owners and shareholders, and to advertisers too, as well as entities like the government, which allow them access to their resources. Jeff Bezos, once at that point the richest man in the world, may be public enemy number one for an American Marxist for his unparalleled role in cruel exploitation. Is it profitable for him to let his own semi-liberal news outlet, the Washington Post, enable class consciousness? Of course not. Sure, they can talk about race or gender occasionally. Those headlines attract a wide, socially conscious audience, and yet don't threaten his ability to continue wielding his power. But if you mention class struggle, and he's revealed as the bad guy requiring overthrowing. This is why CNN and MSNBC and WAPO and the New York Times and Bloomberg will not talk about the real depth to the evils of capitalism or ever reflect a Marxist critique of the status quo. It would be too risky, and perhaps only the blatantly disingenuous Tucker Carlson, whose blatant scapegoating has already been cemented, by which false consciousness has already been firmly engraved in his audience's politics, who would dare to even mention the disparity of class. When one Vicente Navarro attempted to publish his findings, suggesting racial difference are largely reflecting class differences, no American medical journal would take it, where a British journal jumped at the opportunity. So US media is not reviving a conscience for Marxism, it is in fact actively suppressing any mention of it. There's an interesting quote from George Lucas, the director of Star Wars. Because in the world we live in the system we've created for ourselves in terms of, it's a big industry, you cannot lose money. So the point is that you're forced to make a particular kind of movie. And I used to say this all the time with people, back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they'd say, oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America? And I'd say, well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers, and they have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want. You have to adhere, in America, to a very narrow line of commercialism. With that in mind, Hollywood is a little bit different from the rest of the media. Once again, instead of art for the sake of cultural enrichment, Hollywood is driven by the free market. Art is for the sake of profit, and whatever makes money is successful. When Hollywood tries to appear socially conscious, it is because it's attempting to tap into a socially conscious audience. There's plenty of stuff behind the scenes that isn't pretty, as we know, with the cases of figures such as Weinstein, or the alleged involvement of some figures with people like Epstein, for example. Again, the question of ownership comes into play regarding not only the conduct of the corporations behind much of the TV and streaming industry, but also the control and power held by producers in Hollywood. As has already been alluded to, the power of the artistic and cultural expression of directors is actually severely limited. Former director Andrei Konchalovsky recounts that the producers, the mega-rich profiteers, have the real last word regarding how and who directors shoot. Konchalovsky, from his own experience directing Tango and Cash, goes so far as to claim that the job of director could be done by a 5-year-old, and that the real successors in Hollywood are the advertisers. Again, Hollywood is under the thumb of those in power, not the revolutionary Marxists. When looking at Hollywood's narratives in more detail, or media narratives more generally for that matter, and there is indeed an easy-to-spot trend, not that they align with an undercover Marxist insurgency, but rather that they tend to align closely with the official stance of the Pentagon at any given time. This may be why, in the midst of World War II, Hollywood was indeed churning out praise for Stalin's USSR. The Russians were people that the Americans were supposed to feel sympathy for and kinship with more than the common German enemy. People that the American soldiers would have to be prepared to die in defense of, those Russians. After all, this was the 1940s, around the time Bauer's wishes to supposedly return to. Following the war, however, suddenly Hollywood drastically changed its tune. It remade a previous hit, The North Star, as Armored Attack, but now with a completely new narrative, one in which Nazi-Soviet comparisons were made. The original director was shamed as a communist, but actually got off quite lightly in comparison to the complete purge of actors and directors by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Essentially, McCarthyist show trials that ended careers, put people behind bars, and even drove some to suicide. From this purge on, Hollywood fell back in line with the will of the US government, creating a blacklist of all communists and many non-communists wrongly suspected to be communists, and the kind of films then promoted, were starting to pejoratively cast Russian and Chinese villains. For example, Ninochka, I was a communist for the FBI, I married a communist, Red Moscow, guilty of treason, and the Red Menace. The CIA was even linked to the funding of an adaptation of Animal Farm, and when the Cold War heated up again towards the end, the archetypes only increased, Rocky IV being a well-known example. In order to use any military hardware, imagery, or personnel, Hollywood needs the approval of the Pentagon, the possessors of this tech, so that they too can read the scripts, they can make adjustments to films even as apolitical as Meet the Parents. Once again, the establishment is incriminated in the censorship and ideological conditioning of Hollywood. In other media, US presidents performed similar tricks. The press cut down and almost completely silenced coverage of the atrocities in East Timor due to the allegiances of the perpetrators, Indonesia, a US ally, especially when compared to the somewhat comparable crisis in Cambodia, which was massively reported on. The few instances of real left-wing independent journalism have been subject to intimidation and abuse for publishing left-wing and anti-imperialist talking points, even today by neoliberal governments. For his coverage of the situation with Venezuela, Max Blumenthal was roughly arrested by the FBI without a warrant on falsified charges and was denied a lawyer. Glenn Greenwald, whatever you think of him now, has faced physical abuse and harassment for his investigation into the political imprisonment of Brazilian left-leaning politician Lula da Silva. And Julian Assange, as well, faces perhaps the rest of his life in prison for revealing to the public the horrific acts committed by the US government, which he made available through WikiLeaks. But their voices, nonetheless, are sparse and kept as quiet as the establishment can keep them, so no harm is done to their cause. So yeah, presidents like Obama are not our guys, to say the least. So you can maybe now, hopefully, go and blame the neoliberals who they actually represent, instead of blaming some kind of cultural Marxist conspiracy, which doesn't exist and clearly wouldn't be in favor of half the stuff that the conspiracy is churning out. Actually, no, it's not just half the stuff. Neoliberalism is the antithesis of communism. I think that's pretty clear. Perhaps one of the most esoteric of esoteric traditions is the notion that culture and knowledge are not static, but subject to develop. The taming of the horse, the development of runes, to give examples from the old ancestors to the Yamnaya, these weren't a result of clinging puritanically to the past, but using the lessons of their past and the past of those whom they encountered as foundations to the future. The key to esotericism, arguably, is understanding the mold of traditionalized knowledge or custom, not simply replicating it without application. The scientific method may have been a defining feature of a global intellectual tradition instead of a strictly Western esoteric one. Its fundamentalist empiricism was keen to completely throw the learned pragmatic protocols of the past. But nonetheless, esoteric knowledge, or learned cultural practices alternatively, is in part a result of a process of trial, improvement, in adopting the strategies that work, and then passing them down through the generations, which in itself could easily be interpreted as a somewhat scientific process. The point is, wherever you think knowledge and action should come from, there are some situations in which we do, definitively, have to adjust the way we live so as to keep up with the changing social conditions around us. Global warming is happening. There should be no debate about the subject. All credible scientific reports and data reveal that the global temperature has increased by around 1 degree Celsius over the past 100 years or so, most of that warming occurring in the past 35 years. Warmest years on record are continuously and frequently topped. Ocean temperatures have risen about 1/4 degree, I use Celsius, I get used to it, over the past 50 years alone. Snow is melting on lower mountain tops sooner and sooner each year, and glaciers all over the world are in retreat. Now, it may sound like these margins sound relatively trivial, but to put this in perspective, Greenland is losing almost 300 billion tons of ice each year for the past 30 years. Antarctica is losing 127 billion tons likewise. Arctic ice is steadily disappearing altogether. That melting ice, in turn, results in changes to the sea level. The 20th century saw an increase of 8 inches, and the 21st sea level has been increasing at double the rate of last century each year, and accelerating. The oceans, which absorb heat instead of deflecting it, and absorb increasingly less CO2, we'll get into that in a bit, sets depletion onto a vicious cycle. This is physical, demonstrable evidence that we must react to. Remember also that a 1 degree increase means temperatures similar to those of 6000 BC, when the American Midwest was a desert, and around a third of the population may lose access to fresh water across the world, along with even more extreme weather events, such as wilder hurricanes from increased water vapor in the atmosphere. A 2 degree rise, the international upper target, could see sea levels rise by a meter, displacing 10% of the world's population, a third of all life on Earth, battling extinction, and the stagnation of plant growth, in which case plant respiration is no longer counterbalanced by photosynthesis, and we completely lose control on the CO2 front. At 3 degrees, floods and stronger hurricanes become commonplace. Lack of fresh water leads to salt water flowing upstream, polluting our agriculture, and this is the UN's estimated increase. 4 degrees and the thaw of the permafrost releases mass amounts of flammable methane into the atmosphere. Expect lightning storm fireballs, along with all kinds of nasty viruses, and unprecedented amounts of climate refugees are almost certain to lead to global instability. Over 4 degrees, and the sulfur dioxide levels now destroy the ozone layer, and its hydrogen sulfide from stagnant water turns both ocean and air toxic, and it's essentially, at that point, endgame for life on Earth. Where debate does exist, though probably shouldn't, is the cause of global warming. Now, it just so happens that the ever-increasing rate of climate change, unprecedentedly high for the era in which human society has been established, happens to coincide with the massive increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The scientific consensus, calculated between 90% and 100% by numerous studies, Orskes in 2004, Toren and Zimmerman in 2009, Anderegg in 2010, Rosenberg in 2010, Cook in 2013, Stenhouse in 2014, Verhagen in 2014, Pew Research in 2015, and Carlton in 2015. is that this added carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has, along with other gases, most notably methane, water vapor, nitrous oxide, and CFCs, functions somewhat like the glass walls of a greenhouse, allowing heat from the sun to still enter the greenhouse, our atmosphere, but in doing so altering the wavelength of the heat waves so it can no longer escape, hence trapping more heat from the sun within the Earth's atmosphere. Methane is even more greenhousey, but does not remain in the atmosphere for as long as CO2. Water vapor, while the most abundant greenhouse gas, is less troubling given its forming precipitation. The 97% statistic from Cook's study was based on his analysis of how many peer-reviewed, i.e. triple, quadruple checked by those with expert scientific qualifications and revised accordingly, was peer-reviewed scientific articles on climate science fit the notion that recent climate change has been driven mostly by the aforementioned greenhouse effect, and was confirmed by the authors of each paper themselves as to whether they deemed their papers to support or conform or to reject this model. These studies themselves, by the way, are also peer-reviewed, and pretty much every reputable scientific panel or organization affirms this consensus. Which really is more likely? The idea that a secret, undetected hive mind of scientists and activists are secretly trying to put their limited funds into seeing through an ideologically inconsistent cultural Marxist conspiracy? Or the idea that the massive fossil fuel industries of coal, oil, and gas are spending their gargantuan profits, this is including 6 of the 8 largest corporations in the world, 3 of the top 4, on lobbyists and propaganda to cover truths that might stop them from continuing to accumulate wealth. To ignore or disregard what the vast majority of the most statistically and scientifically informed experts say have the potential to do such colossal damage is completely nonsensical and should not be taken with any political sincerity. At the same time, we can still prevent the worst from occurring if we take decisive action and are prepared to alter global energy consumption. Another piece of scientific consensus proclaims that we can still avoid a 2-degree rise if we limit total human carbon emissions to 2.9 trillion tons, 2/3 of which we have already expended. Continuing at the current rate of fossil fuel combustion, we'd surpass this allowance within the next 20 years, and currently fossil fuel corporations have enough fossil fuel reserves to expend that remainder of our alliance 5 times over. So keeping this fuel in the ground would be a massive loss to the private corporations, and if we let them continue without regulation or repossession of their industries, then they cannot afford for their short term not to use them for fuel, and that would doom us consequently in the long term. We need to be moving to more sustainable energy as soon as possible, be it nuclear, geothermal, whatever it is. Characterizing a green movement to be a force with any other agenda than to prevent complete destruction for average and poorer citizens is blatantly disingenuous for Powers to claim. If he himself is not fossil fuel funded, then somebody he trusts certainly will be. Furthermore, and while we're talking about scientifically undebatable crises, coronavirus, yes, it exists, yes, peer-reviewed data has confirmed its danger level, and yes, free market capitalism and lack of control over the economy, or rather, control over the economy in the hands of profiteers, not people looking out for your interests, will have devastating effects as we keep the economy locked down for COVID. We shouldn't have to choose between virus deaths and a complete economic slump, yet when mega corporations aren't prepared to lose money, so they sack you in times of lower consumption, this is what happens. Maybe you can see why maybe focusing on collective good over individual profit may be of some advantage in overcoming crisis. As aforementioned, conservatism and old pre-liberal traditions have historically reacted and adapted to the new conditions in which they find themselves. Subsequently, it is by no means diverging from an esoteric tradition that's established to respond to climate change. Now let us expand this argument to the conditions of modern society more generally. the social sciences, or perceived increases in their held influence, are often at the epicenter of this cultural Marxist infiltration hypothesis, namely that the overcritical nihilism of the modern education system, peddled by a whole host of conspiratorial Marxist professors, are part of the intellectual vanguard of the entire transition that the infiltration wishes to carry out. Sociology is the one we're going to be talking about the most here, though we will also, of course, reference the intersecting, more specialized fields, which often take the most of the heat: gender studies, African American studies, etc. Modern society, as a whole, is governed by a very different social structure to any previous epoch in human history. Things such as consumerism, mass production, globalization, all have made us behave in very different ways to pre-industrial lifestyle or interactions. If you acknowledge this truth, that the conditions brought about by modern society have affected how we live and how our societies work, then congratulations. Linking those new emerging social phenomena with the conditions of the changing time is what sociology is for, and whatever your perspective, you are somewhat of a sociologist in doing so. That's right, sociology is merely a field of study, and hence it is non-partisan and subject to debate and difference of opinion. It is true that many polarizing figures such as Karl Marx or Michel Foucault have indeed made massive contributions to sociology with their close analysis. Many academics and students may find their thought processes convincing. But there are more right-wing sociological perspectives to choose from when studying the subject too. Herbert Spencer, for instance, was an individualist and social Darwinist, not to be confused with actual Darwinian theory. He was a sociologist who saw survival of the fittest as a defining characteristic of human nature. His perspective is wrong and not so popular today, as it has been thoroughly challenged by many times, such as by Pyotr Kropotkin, who details the rich history of mutual aid throughout human relations, though nothing stopping any conservative from coming back and arguing in its defense, so long as, of course, they put in the adequate research to find convincing evidence to back up their claims. Marx almost certainly would not be as big a name as he is in sociology today had people not studying the field found many people studying the field not found many of his conclusions to be well evidenced and continually relevant, although the proportion of Marxists in academia is almost certainly exaggerated by some paranoid conservatives. Should it really matter so much? Obviously, any sociological theory is, to an extent, very difficult to definitively prove, unlike more measurable and calculable sciences, but the core to sociological study is the same: usage of the scientific method, looking at all the facts available on your particular interest, making a hypothesis as to what the facts show, and then bringing in aspects that prove or disprove that hypothesis. Heck, if you want to have a different epistemology to scientific observation, and you want to base your methodology on, say, a religious text instead, go ahead. It may not be widely accepted, given that science is generally presumed to be a logical way of learning new things amongst the population, but it would still be a contribution of sorts to sociology. And note, just because one may agree with Marx's analysis as to how capitalism affects humans and their societies, this doesn't make them automatically in favor of uprooting the system on their own accord. Many Marxists, those in academia especially, see Marxism as descriptive, not prescriptive. After all, sociology is more about describing why things happen than what we have to do about the problems raised. Admittedly, it is responsible for raising those problems which need to be resolved, and that many out of different perspectives or epistemologies may deny that that problem is a sociological premise for political action. But the idea that the sociology class is a revolutionary training camp is ridiculous. And critical theory, too, is in exactly that same boat. The works of Marcuse and Adorno and all the other main Frankfurt School scapegoats are mere investigations into the nature of human society's current situation, as opposed to prescribing action. We've already talked a fair bit about the Frankfurt School, but fundamentally their contribution to academia was to label from where ideology and false consciousness has come to prominence, having been in other preceding societies not on this same scale. The notion of the culture industry, with appropriation of almost all channels of expression by the mainstream, for instance, may beget many proposals for left-wing solutions, but the analysis of state and media and how they are weaponized in favor of the establishment, their appropriation figures of resistance and nonconformity, perhaps through a tactical facade of pluralism or tolerance, and the covering of class differences. If the right have any solutions to these phenomena, we're ready and waiting to hear them. If you'd rather instead deny these phenomena, including, incidentally, phenomena that we have detailed in this video, you should probably go back and read and dissect the methodology and evidence of Marcuse's work, instead of making up conspiracy theories about him. The fact of the matter is that we do struggle with social inequalities and injustice within our society. It might be the alienation or discrimination caused by deep-existing, deep-rooted stereotypes, sometimes formed off the backs of a narrow, colonial, patriarchal, cis-heteronormative mindset from societies where these structures were unabashedly adopted, that go forth and create prejudice. It may be more concrete, such as when these prejudices meet the job market or the justice system. It may be that the perspective of those from these marginalized minority identities and cultures is not recognized and represented in various social positions and roles, hence making it difficult for their contributions to our cultural fabric to be respected or included as those of the androcentric and Eurocentric perspectives. Perhaps one of the only ways to tell is to listen to people, listen to their experiences and challenges, and acknowledge where some have it easier than others in certain contexts, dare I say, privilege. This then opens the newest social scientific fields of gender studies and so on. Their purpose is to try and explain the recounted experiences of those of certain identities, again through scientific observational method in most cases. Why are current race relations and gender differences they are? Are they historically and culturally consistent enough to appear as a facet of one human nature? Hint, look at prehistoric primitive communism, look at gender fluidity and non-binary gender identity in pre-colonial America, New Zealand or India, study the largely unexplored wealth of historical African civilizations, look at all corners of the world from a broader anthropological perspective, and you'll have your answer. Again, invoking critical theory, which parts of our own standard cultural practices and norms might be enforcing the effects that we would rather live without. The conclusion often with these issues is that because the present system was built on the historically unequal ground of colonialism, patriarchal social structure, and their institutions, the institutions of today still retain many aspects of previously more overt oppression. The oppression of today is still less overt, but we still have racism, neocolonialism, misogyny, etc. within our society. Microaggressions or smaller aspects of continuity from the assumptions and behaviors of history may seem trivial to some, but when normalized, the dated and supremacist sentiments at the root of these assumptions and behaviors continue to persist and cause problems for the citizens of our society. When we encounter them in our culture, it is worth pointing them out and contextualizing them, so that the culture we create from here on out can help do its part for the continual trial and improvement that is cultural progression of an esoteric tradition. To improve, we should and must be prepared to criticize and analyze. There are those who like to allege that these social sciences have become all-encompassing, overshadowing every medium of cultural and artistic expression for complete cultural purity, or as some call it, political correctness, though self-evidently this is not the case. Sociologists and gender theorists may well critique cultural works, but they don't sit on a panel approving or denying every project of expression the way financial committees and boards tend to do. Plus, would it not make sense to criticize a cultural excerpt aiming to comment on, say, gender, without interacting with the existing perspectives and theories on the subject? So no, universities are not indoctrination camps, nor are sociology classes teaching pure revolutionary zealotry. In fact, university may be one of the few places where you are conscious and actively critical of all the subjects you learn about, as opposed to merely sapping up the conditioning of mass media and industrial culture. And critical theory should not necessarily be considered an enemy of esotericism at all as a result. Part of what makes the whole conspiracy theory so dangerous overall is its central prescription. Disingenuously, the proposed solution that Bowers recommends to combat cultural Marxism utilizes religious fundamentalism to discourage human beings from taking control of their own destiny. It discourages from standing up to prevent the rise of corporate power or the global financial order under the supposed neoliberal consensus. It discourages people from preventing environmental disaster or overcoming crisis in the most societally just and efficient manners. It discourages people from evaluating the shortcomings and changes within modern society to improve the world for everyone. The crime of cultural Marxism, it is insisted, is in human hubris. Human rationale, Bowers might argue, is deeply flawed where God's plan is divine and flawless. Hence it is our own hubris, our belief that we can do better than God, which pushes our society to stray into disarray and destruction. Marx, it is true, was an atheist. He was one of the philosophers that the conspiracy implicates essentially as a false prophet away from God. His modernistic search for a universal truth, independent universal truths, brought people away from the one pre-modernistic truth, that all truth and purpose is from God. This is why, a fundamentalist may argue, regimes claiming to represent his ideas fell into strife and eventual destruction, because any society based on a product of human rationalism will never compare to one based on divinity and trust in the system that's given to us by a deity. Darwin, another philosopher deemed to be sowing the seeds for such godless, wayward abominations and for delusions of human grandeur, is too portrayed as an enemy. I'm not going to respond to young earth creationism here because it's of little political significance to this issue, though I'm pretty sure I will address it at some point or other, as was the godless nihilistic cries of Nietzsche. Through prayer, he wasn't actually a nihilist, but that's another question. Through prayer, it is suggested, perhaps we can find the right path again, according to Bowers. Except this is in its entirety a complete misnomer, because in our neoliberal free market under a corporate profiteering establishment, there are people and institutions who are physically in control. The superstitious idea that rationalization via any epistemology, be it esoteric or modern intellectual or whatever, cannot be trusted, is to prevent us from improvement and lock us into the status quo, a status quo not with God at the helm, but massive corporate entities and lobbyists bending the world to their own individual profits. If you are a religious fundamentalist or conservative, your deference on social, political, and scientific matters to God is only cementing and consolidating the control of a different godless clique, but ones that only seek their own personal profits as opposed to liberty, equality, and shared prosperity. The whole point of this entire conspiracy theory is to encourage everybody in their governments to stop interfering with the financial order's attempts to expand, framing any attempt at overcoming this order as part of a malevolent underground revolution that simply does not in reality exist. To limit thought is to limit freedom. Only by embracing our own thought processes can we truly discover the way we feel it is right to live, and have the ability to go ahead and live that life. In doing so, we must be prepared to look at the world through our own and others' eyes, and try constantly to improve what we have and bring us closer to that freedom, to productively build upon society, not destroy it for chaos's sake. We should not be scared. We should be proactive. Reject the false premise of a cultural Marxist conspiracy. Reject its calls to keep you subservient to the status quo. Let us overthrow the sacrilegious, unjustified hierarchies of our current establishment and, let's go on to the final section. So to recap, we've covered how a cultural Marxist conspiracy and all of its perceived goals, including the step-by-step program alleged by Bowers and Skousen, is completely inconsistent with real-life Marxist theory. We've talked about how the establishment is extremely hostile to Marxism and employs a neoliberal economic ideology that brings strife to not only Marxists but also cultural conservatives and other non-Marxists. We've looked at the lies that ideologues like Bowers weaponize to conflate the status quo with the left as a means of distracting from pressing economic injustice. This was a little bit longer than I expected, but do not worry, we are approaching the end. It has been said of social conservatism that its purpose is to defend the aspects of a rich cultural history that it deems to be worth conserving, to exercise caution in removing a wealth of learned information we have taken from so many cultures, be it the Indo-European language structure of North Caucasian Yamnaya, the mathematical and scientific foundations of the Arabic Muslims, the familial social structures of the Middle Eastern Semitic Abrahamic religions, the global intellectual tradition of rational thought, free expression, and so forth, to name a mere few. It has the job of defending the esoteric values and systems of humanity we live under, the things our ancestors and influencers did to make their lives richer and easier, and the things we still do today, despite having largely forgotten the original reasoning. When we talk about culture, we're talking about the rich mix of traditions and life hacks passed down to the various social groups we partake in, and influencing the way we perceive the world and our surrounding, giving us an identity. No two individuals have the exact same cultural identity, as each person is differently influenced by different groups to differing degrees. It could be made up of family traditions, national cultures, pop subcultures, etc. But it's certain to be a massive multicultural mix of different practices and traditions of many differing sources. What you wear is cultural, what you eat is cultural, what you speak, how you spend your time, how you think, what you enjoy, who you pray to, this is all part of your own pluricultural identity. The allegation that Marxists want to destroy many of your core cultural practices is largely illogical and unproven, citing the reasons we've covered. I might not be a Marxist myself per se, but I know that culture is powerful, and when theorists like Gramsci essentially prescribe returning culture from the elites and hegemons to the control of the people, they're talking about a move to empower the masses of the world, not blind or incapacitate them. Marxists, who see grassroots socialism as the inevitable result of this empowerment, have a clear reason to want to enrich culture for the people, instead of destroying it. It is instead, as aforementioned, the neoliberals and the lobbyists for the extreme right economics, which are prepared to sell out culture for profit. Which leaves us with a question, putting the question of Marxist theory aside for now, under which society can we really see culture thrive under? My answer would be a society of what I have previously described as intellectual perpetuity, the investigation, exploration, and evaluation of esoteric traditions, especially those of civilizations we might not ourselves descend from, but who might also have some great ideas to look into, is largely an intellectual exercise, as is the analysis of modern society to design and introduce new and relevant aspects to culture, to aid our lives further, and continue creating the many glorious wonders of our world, ancient and modern, physical and immaterial, arts and scientific discoveries, philosophy and policy. As a result, surely the way to send us into a new cultural golden age would be a society where the liberty for us to engage in these intellectual activities is as high as possible, where anyone from any of our unique perspectives can partake in these activities and contribute their own insights, free from coercion or ideology, where we can all be free to live our lives according to the values we have decided upon. What prevents us from pursuing these broader intellectual practices is that we have material needs we also need to satisfy. Hence, we have to instead concentrate on performing other tasks, such as sourcing materials to fulfill those needs, earning a living, and turning our concentration away from abstract thinking or hypothetical conceptualizations at the root of cultural creation. And yet, as a species, we overproduce. With the amount of food we produce, we could feed the entire world were it not for the monetary obstacle preventing many people from accessing it sufficiently. And by challenging and taking down an artificial, virtueless consumer culture, we can also redirect production towards a less wasteful, less labor-intensive society. With the potential utilization of technology, we can make this process even more fruitful and efficient for the workers and consumers involved. But if these modes of production and distribution are determined by the interests of profit, well, there we can find an obstacle to the prioritization of cultural activities or intellectual perpetuity. Creating a society where we can achieve this kind of economy is not an easy process, and it's a question of craniomodernism. Transition to such a society requires acknowledging and exploring the psychological phenomenon of internalization, and potentially a program of controlled socialization to train our instincts towards a different, more equal and familial survival strategy. But you don't have to give up your religious values or your traditions or anything else of cultural worth that you deem under threat. In fact, this might be the only way to preserve these things that you hold dear from an ever-expanding neoliberal world order. If you want to conserve, if you value culture, if you value moral philosophy, I would strongly urge you to read and watch more of my work on craniomodernism as it comes out. Together we can advocate a world focused on cultural integrity, regardless of whether we identify as left or right. But first, it's important that we understand the true nature of the threats and from where they arise. And on that note, I hope this video has been of use and enjoyment. And a quick postscriptum. To any other leftists who are watching this, I feel this conclusion may be worth considering regarding the current or the previous electoral context of the USA. Around the time of the election, there was a misguided effort to guide conservatives on a pipeline through neoliberalism, such as with the Lincoln Project, for example, among many leftists. Consider instead, when engaging with conservatives, letting them be, more productive at conserving. You might find that if you actually get to the root of how to conserve, there is a lot more that victims of modern alienation can agree upon than you might expect.